This story begins with a not very happy event. A poor girl, almost without clothes, was running in the bitter cold, fleeing from the danger that was pursuing her. She recalled her mother's last words to her sweet daughter, pleading for her to survive. The girl wanted her to live in their place. Her brother was gone, her father had died a tragic death, and the woman herself would soon be finished. That was why she asked that no matter what happened there, the girl should live and not give up in any way. The poor lost girl was running away from the people who were chasing her, even with the dogs. She was running barefoot in the cold snow, and all her feet were covered with cuts and scratches. Since this chase had begun, she had run deep into the woods, and outside the sun was beginning to go down. She paused briefly to catch her breath as she suddenly heard some footsteps beside her and the harsh breathing of a horse. A man approached the girl, and when he saw her, he turned to the Lord, seeing her pale face and tattered clothes. He said she looked like a forest spirit of some kind. He immediately dismounted from his horse, and coming close to the girl, began to remove his cloak. The stranger said that even forest spirits could apparently freeze. He handed her the cloak and asked if the girl was all right. Of course, the little girl said nothing to this. She just stood there, watching his actions warily. The man said he understood perfectly well that she was afraid and wary of him, but he could see perfectly well that she was very cold. The stranger slowly approached her and held out his cloak again, saying she'd better take this so she wouldn't freeze to death. He examined her from head to toe and said that she was in the woods all alone at dawn, and she was soaking wet. Well, then he smiled gently to encourage the girl, and said it was a good thing at least she had survived it all. The girl continued to stand still and did not move. She looked at him with a cold and detached gaze the whole time. Then the man replied that she could run, for he would not chase. In turn, the little girl reached out to the coat and took it, for she was indeed incredibly cold. Noticing her strange clothes, he said that she must be from a faraway land. Then he explained that the place was called Arong, and the local lord was Dalbury. The girl, in turn, wrapped herself in her fur coat and remained silent. He asked her what her name was. In fact, her name is Dawn, but she remained silent for some time. Then the man asked if she would not tell him, or if she simply did not know the language of the country. Dawn was silent for a while longer, but then she looked up and said her name, looking at the man. At this very time, a military camp had formed in the deep woods, and a famous man was just sitting in it. The man with blonde hair was going through the letters and, with a heavy sigh, said that he was being invited to various balls again. Everyone is so desperate for him to marry their daughters. That's why they write him letters for various nonsense. It annoyed him beyond belief. He had never liked all those events, banquets, balls, and tea parties, all of which he considered a morass, But at that moment his aide came out to him and said that he stood out from all the other men, for at 12 he had already received the title of lord, and at 28 he was still cold. The man also said that the king himself gave him the name Gwyn, which means beautiful poet. So it is not surprising that all fathers want to marry their daughters to him. But the man looked at the aide, sighing heavily, and asked what was the point of all this, since marriage still depended on the wealth and status of the parents. The guy opened his notebook and said that if he suddenly wanted riches and fame, the best option was to marry a princess. All women are exactly the same. He just needs to choose the one that gives him the most. The master looked at him and said, "It depends on which way you look at it. What if there was a girl of his dreams in this world?" Of course, the aide did not believe him, and sighing heavily, said that he was a known womanizer to everyone, that even the king had to intervene in the matter to calm him down. So it is not for him to say these words. He will never find a woman with whom he will fall in love and cannot live without her. They came to a hump that overlooked a fine view of the castle, and said that he had heard that the old Earl of Dalbury was dead, and did not understand why they had then gone at all. This camp had many different tents that held weapons for the worst turn of events. Gwyn turned to go to his tent again, after thinking about it, and his aide said it was not like him at all. The man didn't say anything. He knew that the guy was right, because after a light battle, alcohol and food tasted like water. Powerful aristocrats remind him of hyenas who rush with war on weak opponents in order to take their territories. And the king, in turn, does nothing to prevent these wars and disputes. He wants the feudal lords to weaken and exhaust their powers, all because the aristocrats have become so powerful that they threaten even royalty. However, by leaving the aristocrats alone and not interrupting their battle, the queen's presence in the country became more and more minuscule. That's why the king finally decided to suppress the power of the aristocrats, and as a result, the entire kingdom is now in absolute tension. However, the land of the deceased Earl of Dalbury, the small land of Orang, remained peaceful, as if time had simply stood still in this place. The local castle is not well built, and there are very few soldiers in the place. However, the locals are fighting side by side to stop the enemy that is approaching. His aide sighed and said that the combat power in this place was minimal anyway, and it was a matter of time until they were run over. And if the small castle of Orang doesn't hold out, various rumors will spread that Eskar's army is worthless. However, he said that the situation is very even, so there should be no problem. Gwyn said that there was nothing good about it actually, because the enemy's morale was quite high, and that was already worth a lot. The man also heard that Dalbury was a good man, but he didn't think he was worth laying down his head for. At that moment the assistant turned to some knight and asked that they bring that thing to him. Soon the lad handed the gentleman an arrow with a note and said they had received an answer. Gwyn, opening the letter, replied that they had said they would cut everyone out if they didn't open the gate, so they would now see what the answer was. The letter said that the gate would be opened only to the ruler, but it was not the answer itself that interested the man, but the handwriting. He thought about it and realized that it was most likely a woman's handwriting. However, he didn't understand why they weren't going to give up. In reality, this raging war is just a game to him. He hides his true goals from the royal family and the aristocrats. In fact, Orang City was just unlucky enough to be in the guy's way. However, it still surprised him that they would only open the gates to the ruler. When the blade was already at her throat, she wrote those words anyway. He'd actually seen countless women on his journey, but this was the first time he'd ever seen one like this. The man clenched the piece of paper in his fist and smiled evilly, wondering who she even was. Then the man turned to the assistant and inquired what the messenger had said. The guy replied that he was saying that they were ready for a siege, and it seemed to be really true that they were going to sit on the defensive and defend everything to the last. Gwyn asked if he remembered correctly that Dalbury had as many as 2 sons. The man replied that he was correct. One of these sons was the eldest son Alvin, and the youngest son was by a second young wife. Now it is this son of the younger wife who is the most important. However, the man said that he did not particularly believe that the young woman had decided to sit under siege. The aide waved his head and said that by their calculations, they should have surrendered on the first day, since they didn't have all that much developed to fight. Furthermore, this wife's faction is already willing to surrender the castle. When the man heard this, he became very excited and wondered who was then born with him right now. Gwyn wondered with a possessed smile on his face. Is cowardly Alvin fighting him now? The assistant replied that apparently there was a slave of the deceased Dalbury beside Alvin. The man was surprised to hear this and asked, "What slave?" Then the aide clarified, saying that to be more precise, she was a slave. By law, she could not be a concubine. However, apparently she was a concubine of the deceased earl, and some also say that she even has a cute appearance. Gwyn looked at the letter again and said that it was likely that this woman was just as likely to control Alvin as she was to go straight against him. The man immediately realized that the letter had been written by a slave who had been picked up in the woods 7 years ago, some skinned foreigner. The man thought that she must have been very beautiful. Then he turned to his assistant and asked if he thought her name was Dayon. However, the aide replied that he didn't memorize women specifically in such a case. Gwyn assumed that she remained loyal to the one who had once lent her a helping hand. The aide thought about it and said that apparently that was indeed true, and she must be a little over 20 now, if you counted correctly. She's even rumored to have her own unique charisma, and she's so beautiful that you can't even look away from her. Many people even forget that she is a slave. Gwyn sat back down on his barrel and smiled and said that he would like to meet her someday, but the aide sighed heavily and replied that he didn't even doubt it. Well, the man in that case said that they would just tear that castle down. The assistant looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked, "How does he even envision that?" They were silent for a while, thinking about a plan of action. The aide said that even though they were completely isolated and couldn't get information from outside, They only had to hold out for a week. The master, hearing this, looked at the assistant and inquired, "Is it really she who says so herself?" The aide replied that yes, and all these assumptions are based on the fact that it will get cold very early this year. And secondly, the third territory of Geryon borders the sea, and the army will have to retreat. The master immediately picked up on his thoughts and realized that it was because of the threat of attack by pirates from the sea, who didn't care at all about the territory. All they wanted was more money. And then the deputy said the very last, the third paragraph, that this woman, on the day Dalberry died, wrote a petition and gave it to one of the soldiers. The girl also ordered him, in case the enemy attacked, to carry him to the royal palace no matter what. Gwyn, hearing this, wondered and wondered. He smiled and thought that this girl was very brave after all, and now he was even more interested in her. But the aide said one other important thing, that if this petition eventually reached the king, he would intervene in the matter. If this all happens, Gwyn said he would not see this slave girl, and also inquired how her relationship with his second wife was at all. The aide replied that the girl was just a slave, and if it hadn't been for Elwyn, she would have been killed the day the earl died. No one would have been ceremonious. The man also said that it would be quite profitable for the second wife to get rid of her if she did not want bloodshed. Gwyn, hearing this, said that in that case he had a present for the second wife. Seeing the aide's surprised face, he said that the girl hadn't left the castle for a long time, and had probably forgotten what it was like to go to a luxury ball. He asked that they tell her that he had a special gift to help her feel it all again, and that they had not come to them as enemies. He told them to pass on that he wanted to protect this land from invasion by the other lords. Supposedly they were on their side. Gwyn sighed and said that was the promise they had made to each other to Dalberry when he was still alive. Then the aide wondered if, instead of sitting on opposite sides, she might be better off opening the gate. The man laughed and told the man to tell him that the finest lad on the whole continent, Gwyn Eskar Malhut, wished to see the beautiful Aranka, her widow. The assistant was very annoyed by his master's arrogance, but he sighed heavily and said that he needed a slave. So why is he making all these unnecessary moves? The man in turn asked that he send the letter right away, and by morning the gift would be ready. The assistant had nothing else to do but fix himself, so he stopped asking questions. But when Gwyn heard her assistant's heavy sigh, she looked at him indignantly, not understanding why he was having such a reaction. The guy in turn said that he should have gotten used to it by now, that he sighed like that when he heard another idea from him. Of course it wasn't true, but it seemed to go well, and the master didn't suspect anything. He told the boy to start preparing himself. Gwyn explained that he would be looking for a slave girl, and the lad himself would take care of the second wife, and by any means necessary she should open the gate for them. At that moment he slapped his chest, putting the letter down. Some time passed from that moment, and the gentleman, together with his assistant, went over the dais after all. As they walked, Gwyn looked around and was just incredibly surprised, thinking this was all crazy. He couldn't believe he was entering enemy territory without an army or weapons. It was his first time. The aide turned to him at this point and asked him to be careful. After all, if he was uncovered, the situation would get out of hand. The man was actually under a special cloth so no one would see him, and he mockingly wondered if the guy was worried about being here and getting killed on the spot. However, the assistant sighed heavily again and rolled his eyes and said he wasn't worried, but more worried that the guy would just embarrass them all. When the master heard, "It's you," he was very surprised. He did not expect that his assistant would not care at all that he might be killed, but at that moment he got as close as he could to the horse and kicked it in the side. It immediately became agitated, and the assistant went to calm it down so that they would not attract even more attention from people. Gwyn in turn moved closer to them and began to scrutinize the small town in search of the girl. And then he suddenly looked up, as if at the call of his heart, and saw a girl at the top of one of the towers. Her hair was blowing in the wind. Unfortunately, he couldn't see her face because she was too high up. But he couldn't take his eyes off her. Gwyn even removed his defenses, from which no one could recognize him, and rejoiced and told himself that he had found her after all. But at that moment the assistant, who had already managed to calm the horse, saw the gentleman and came closer to him, and followed his gaze. The guy also saw this girl who was standing upstairs and said it was too early yet, Gwyn hadn't expected to be watched, so he was a little surprised. At that moment, another of the guards approached them, and the aide became incredibly stern. The man turned to a knight named Rob and asked that he make sure their master didn't do anything stupid. Rob bowed at once and said that he would do his best and would be sure to follow up with the master. The deputy also said that when it was time to return, the horn would have to be blown twice, and he asked Rob not to let the gentleman escape under any circumstances. The man was still a little surprised, but said he would fulfill everything. Then the two of them heard the master laughing loudly. Gwyn, calming down a little, said that he need not worry, for he himself knew that he could be relied upon. But of course the assistant did not trust his lord's temperament, which was so hot-tempered and windy. In fact, the aide just didn't want to deal with the consequences later because the gentleman might have overdone it. All this time the man stood watching the girl continue to stand at the top of the stairs. Suddenly a knight came up to her and handed her something. Gwyn, seeing this, became alarmed. Then he thought of a plan and suddenly began to scream violently, saying that he had a bad stomachache. The deputy immediately went to get close to him to give him help, but he ran away saying he had to go to the bathroom right away. The men who were left standing alone didn't understand what was going on, and the aide wondered what the gentleman was thinking. Rob sighed heavily at this point, and calling the gentleman an idiot, said that he was incredibly harmful. The man said he sneaked into the enemy castle and yelled that he urgently needed to use the restroom almost to the entire street, and it made them very uncomfortable. At this time, Gwyn ran into an alleyway somewhere and saw several guards sitting on barrels drinking alcohol. He thought about the fact that there was an angry battle going on outside their castle, and the locals were just sitting around chilling over a mug of ale. It made the lad very angry. The men started laughing loudly after another joke, and the guy thought to himself that it was quite obvious, since they were Dalbury soldiers. Soon after that, he did find the entrance where I wanted him to go, and climbing up he saw a lot of people standing there. This made him a little uneasy, but he did not give up. When Gwyn went upstairs, he stood in the same place where the girl had been standing. When he didn't see her, however, he was a little disappointed. The guy stood there for a while, and after that he turned around and went downstairs. He passed by various people looking for the slave girl. And so as he was passing by the marketplace, he heard two men talking. One of them said that this beautiful slave girl was at the well right now. However, at that moment Gwyn heard the loud sound of a horn and became alert. Soon after, he heard Rob's voice coming toward him. He bowed to the gentleman and said that it was time for them to go. The man was very surprised. However, the man was not satisfied with that. He turned around and taking off his disguise asked Rob, "Will the knights now obey Gerard instead of him?" The man laughed at this point and said that the gentleman could believe him, for the lad only wanted the best for him. Gwyn at this point threw off his disguise to the knight and said he was very thirsty. The lad did not interrupt him and said that he could do whatever he wished. The lord himself at this point thought of wanting something that seemed unfathomable to him, but now he wanted to find her and double-check something. In fact, Gwyn is frantic to find out who this woman is, so he and the knight set off to the well to meet her there. As they approached the well, the man saw her sitting directly across from him, and he immediately froze in place. He couldn't take his eyes off this girl. Watched her sit peacefully and quietly leaning on the well, thinking about something of her own. But then suddenly the girl, as if sensing his gaze on her, immediately turned in their direction and their gazes met. Gwyn in turn thought to himself that it was definitely her, and he wanted her to be his incredibly badly. However, the girl at that moment stood up and began to walk off somewhere to the side so as not to disturb these gentlemen. As she was about to leave, Gwyn stepped closer to her and blocked the girl's path. He stood looking at her, smiling. Dawn didn't understand what was going on, or why he wouldn't let her pass. However, she didn't even speak to him, but just stood there patiently. The man smiled for a while longer, then said that even when she was surrounded by enemy soldiers, she didn't show the slightest bit of fear. Dawn looked away from him indifferently and asked if he had heard the rock. It was time for them to leave. However, the man at this point moved even closer to her, and said that she had a very pretty voice and he liked it. She looked at him coldly, and the man immediately removed his hands, saying he just wanted a drink, and wondered if he could ask them for a glass of water. Dawn just stood there looking at him for a while longer. But then she realized he wasn't going to leave until she did. So the girl turned in the other direction, and having drawn water from the well with a bucket, was about to pour it into his hand. However, she didn't even have time to tilt the bucket before he suddenly grabbed her arm, causing all the water to fall to the floor and spill over. Gwyn tugged on her arm and pulled her closer and closer to him. They were incredibly close, so close that he could feel her anxious breathing and see every mole on her surprised face. The man didn't think too long. He grabbed the back of her head and began to kiss her gently on the lips, fulfilling his desire. After a while, they moved away from each other and just stared. The girl was still confused about what had happened. He was about to kiss her again when suddenly Rob came up to them and said it was time to go back. Gwyn ran his palm over her face, tidying her hair, and said he was right after all. Then the man smiled at the girl and thanked her for such a lovely treat. However, he was still a bit confused. The video was the first time he gave in to his instinct. Gwyn smiled at the girl and said that he would like to drink more next time. She didn't react in any way and stood there with a completely calm expression on her face. Daon then stepped around him and picked up the bucket of water she had dropped from him. The man sighed heavily when she was already a distance away from him, and thought about the fact that he had hoped she would at least blush. But no, there was absolutely no reaction. Before long, he did return to the rest of the team with his dreaded one after all. Gwyn asked the assistant what the outcome of their whole adventure had been. The aide himself, when he saw the look on his face, he frowned and realized that he really liked this woman after all. But the guy then replied that they could open the gates for them again tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Gwyn, hearing this, turned around and said with a sly smile that it would probably cost something, since they definitely wouldn't do it for free. The deputy said that quite rightly. The second wife had put some very important conditions on him as well, after which she could let them in. She wants them to execute Earl Alvin's eldest son. Gwyn, hearing this, wasn't even the least bit surprised, and also wondered if that was all she had asked for. But the aide said that she also wanted her youngest son to inherit the Dalbury lands for himself, and if they were to agree to these terms, they should raise the red flag at the camp by sunset. The master climbed back on his horse and remained silent the whole time. The assistant waited for a reply from him so that he could understand what to do. He couldn't stand it any longer and stepped closer to Gwyn and asked what they were going to do. But the man in turn only removed his protective mask and tossed it to the aide. He said that tomorrow they would dine at the castle, and with these words they went to their own grounds. The next day, as promised, the men went to their enemies. The next day, as promised, the men went to their enemies. Gwyn, as he drove closer, took a closer look at the girl and those around her, and one detail really surprised him. In fact, he was accustomed that the enemy should be met in mourning clothes, and they dressed like peacocks, all the most expensive and brightest clothes. As the man drove closer, he sighed heavily and looked away from the girl, who, on the contrary, was watching him intently. She was silent for some time. Then she curtsied and said her name was Mary Dalbury, and she was honored to meet him. The man himself was incredibly surprised. He hadn't expected her to give up so easily. Even though she might still be planning something, he didn't know if he should pretend to let his guard down. She knelt down at that moment, and the man jumped down from his horse. He said that he had heard that she was very beautiful. Gwyn stepped closer to her, and holding out his hand to help her stand up, said he was seeing it with his own eyes now. Mary smiled happily, squeezing his hand in return, and didn't even take her eyes off him. She laughed nervously afterward and, holding out her hand to the side, told them to get in already. They stood like that at the gate. The man smiled back at her, and they then headed to the manor to have lunch. As soon as they entered the dining room, a fully set table was waiting for them. Gwyn took his seat, and the girl took hers across from him. The servants continued to bring them many different treats on the table, as well as alcohol, while others played music for them so that they would not be bored. Mary in turn did not take her eyes off the man for a second, and made eyes at him all the time. Gwyn of course understood that her husband was dead and she might be lonely, but he still felt it was too much to open the gates to the enemy army. He thought she was at least somewhat capable of thinking with her head. Apparently, however, she wasn't. Mary then suddenly spoke. She laughed and complimented him in some way. The man, of course, was just annoyed by all this. and he gave her no other signs. The other people were walking and relaxing, drinking and talking about something. Also played a song about the beautiful goddess of spring, who carries the white robe of the king of winter in her hands, and it was impossible to breathe in the kingdom of winter. On the second verse, however, Gwyn suddenly raised his hand up and clenched it into a fist and asked the musicians to stop, to which they immediately complied, for they were very frightened. Then the man, drawing out each word slowly, inquired, "Is this song to make fun of me?" The musicians were very surprised, but did not know what to say. Then the man turned to the lady and said that apparently he was not welcome here. Mary immediately jumped up and said that it was just a misunderstanding, and they certainly didn't mean anything bad. Gwyn continued to smile and wondered why the song was being played just when he arrived. Mary was incredibly angry at her musicians and at her guest, but she did her best to contain her emotions. At that moment, those people who were singing that song immediately knelt down and began to worship the Lord. In a trembling voice, one of them said that they did not mean to offend anyone, and this song was simply about the goddess of spring who defeated the king of winter. Gwyn, hearing this, slapped his hand on the table and said that the taste of the alcohol was very spoiled. He was very displeased with this behavior. However, at that moment, one of the knights, who was also sitting at the table eating his meal, suddenly felt very ill and fell to the floor. The man seemed to pay no attention. He slowly stretched out each word, saying something about the goddess of spring. Everyone in the room immediately began to stare at him intently, waiting for the next reactions. And Gwyn said that he had also heard that there was a slave girl in this castle, who was as beautiful as the goddess of spring herself from that song. He was referring to Dayon, of course, and turning to Mary, he smiled evasively and also said he'd like to see her. The woman immediately became anxious. She even started biting her nails out of nervousness. Then, thinking about it, she said that there was nothing special about her, as he thought. Gwyn turned sharply in her direction and asked in a rough voice if she was crossing him. But the girl said she wouldn't dare do anything like that. Then Mary explained that it was just that this girl spent all her days surrounded by rednecks, and she could understand why such a simpleton would suddenly be interested in him. She also said that this girl spent every night in her husband's room, and when her husband died, she stayed in Alvin's room until morning. Of course, even when her husband was alive, this girl was still secretly seeing Alvin, and it's likely she wasn't playing tag with him there. Gwyn said nothing, but sipped more alcohol from his glass. Then Mary went on and said that of course she was only interested in rich men. To summarize, the woman also said that, in general, she was very promiscuous, and he had better not deal with her for his own good. The man thought for a moment, but said nothing. Mary turned away and said that on top of everything else, she wasn't that pretty, and they were only interested in her because she was a foreigner. But at that moment she regretted her words, for she saw Gwyn's stern gaze on herself. Mary turned the other way and said she understood, so she would introduce him to her, and went to the other room to call the girl. Soon a servant told Daon that she was to be seen, and she came into the banquet hall. Her outfit was ragged and dirty, and her feet were blistered. When the girl stepped inside, the people who were present in the hall immediately started covering their noses and snorting, not realizing what that smell was. As she passed by, the girl also left some dirty footprints behind her. The men all turned away and said that it was just awful. Gwyn did not take his eyes off the girl, however, and she interested him even more. When the man looked to the side, he saw that Mary was straight up shaking with anger, and concluded that she was definitely jealous of this slave girl. He smiled and turned back to the girl, thinking about how that was probably why she'd thrown her into the pigsty in the first place. He remembered her name, but after a closer look, as she came closer, he concluded that for a slave she looked very dignified and could defend herself. After all, it's usually very shameful for a person to show up like this in front of guests. But she doesn't even seem to mind, not even paying attention to all the stares that are directed at her. She walked forward with her head held high and a confident look in her eyes. Gwyn was already thinking about what he needed to do to win her heart. When the girl was already a few meters away from him, he smiled and said in a quiet voice that she was beautiful. It was quiet, but enough for Mary to hear it, and she looked at him irritably, not sure why he was doing all this in the first place. At this moment, Assistant Gwyn, who was watching all of this closely, thought about how this girl, even in such a situation, kept her composure. He guessed that she was far from being an unusual girl. But to be so, this lady is even more unique than he imagined. In fact, no matter how much a gemstone is covered in dirt, it still retains its luster and value. So it came as no surprise to him at all that the gentleman ended up being interested in her, and he would try to get what he wanted by any means necessary. Then Gwyn, after a short silence, looked at the girl and said that from this day forward she would be his. When Mary heard this, she became very indignant. She turned to the master and said that this woman was a slave, and she did not understand what he was thinking, saying such words. The man replied in turn that he could give her something in return, and inquired what she wanted. But the girl only inquired where Mr. Alvin was now. When the boy heard this, he was very surprised, not understanding why she was asking about Alvin now. She didn't know if she was worried for her safety, or if she was really so in love with him. Gwyn replied in a cold voice that the crows were already pecking at his corpse, and asked if she had any more questions. When the girl heard this news, no emotion appeared on her face. She was silent for a while, but then looked at him and wondered if he would do the same with his second wife and her son. When Mary heard this, she jumped up from her seat and wanted to call her names, but she turned to the guards, asking them to do something. Then the woman spoke to the slave, asking if she even understood what she was saying. Gwyn in turn coughed, and then he started laughing. Mary didn't understand what was going on, but sat back in her seat, realizing that she had no influence on anything. The man in turn looked at the slave girl and asked why she suddenly thought he was going to kill them. Daon was very sure and said he was an enemy of the orang, so he came here with weapons and wants to take it over, to take control of this city. But it's unlikely that he'll be able to rule on his own, so he will appoint someone else to the position. The girl kept talking and said that his second wife would not be loyal to him, so he wasn't going to leave the territory to her for sure. Finishing her thought, she also said that she sees who betrayed once will one day betray again, and the girl very much doubted that he would put away the man who had killed his son, though not his own. At this point, Mary started to object and said that she wasn't the one who killed Alvin. However, Gwyn quickly interrupted her and said that the slave girl was right after all, and he wouldn't entrust territory to someone he couldn't trust. Then the man turned to the knights and told them to come to him. They immediately obeyed his order. When the lord said to have the old woman, her son, as well as the rest of the aristocracy executed, of course the knights immediately carried out his order, and a great deal of blood as well as corpses appeared in that hall. Dawn kept her composure even after such a sight. She just stood there, not even looking at the corpses. Gwyn was of course surprised by all of this, for anyone in her place would have either run away in terror by now, or just started shaking with fear at least. At this point, an assistant came up to the lord and told him that they were finished. He also said that they would inform the king that the castle had been captured and asked that he just sign the paper he was giving him. However, to the man's surprise, Gwyn said in a firm and determined voice that he would not, and added that he would do so tomorrow. He looked at the slave girl and said with a smile on his face that he was in for a busy night tonight. Shortly afterward, Dawn headed for the bathroom. She just sat there for a while, soaking in the water. Outside, the sun was already starting to go below the horizon, and she still continued to sit there. Soon, when the water was quite cold, she finally climbed out and put on her clean clothes. When the girl came to the kitchen, she heard the indignant conversations of the maids. One of them said that the girl had killed the mistress with her words. The girls called her a villain and also accused that even a very young gentleman was not spared because of her. But Dawn paid no attention to all their name-calling. The girl just sat at the table, and the ladies kept saying that she was a terrible woman, and there was no forgiveness for her. One of the maids got close to her and started yelling, saying that it was her, the men, that everyone was drawn to. Apparently, they're just stupid blind men for acting that way. After that, the maid started brushing her hair, but it was very painful. The girl was still patient and did not show weakness. The maids were pitying the poor gentleman, saying that if he had given up a little earlier, he wouldn't even be killed now. And all because she had made him change his mind. They asked the girl how she would sleep at night, when she had so many corpses on her conscience. The maid said that she was the reason the Dalbarakan family was now dead. The other agreed and said that because of her the family was dead forever. At that moment they braided a beautiful braid around her head. Dayon in turn continued to sit in silence and did not say a word. The maids continued to talk, and said that the famous Gwyn Exar Malchut had also invaded. The maid said he had been planning from the beginning to exterminate, for sure, Mouth and Dalbury, and had just found the perfect opportunity. Then the maid turned to the slave and said that she was a human being too, after all, and wondered if she would just continue to remain silent. Of course, Don didn't even respond to that. Then the maid started putting her beautiful hair ornaments in and told her she was just an idiot. But the other maid asked that she stop already, because he would obviously feel bad if this girl told anyone about their behavior. That maid replied with a calm expression that of course the girl would not do that, for she kept everything to herself all the time. Shortly thereafter, one of the house staff came for the girl and began to lead her through the corridors of the castle. It was already dusk outside. So when they got to the front door, the girl turned to him and asked if they happened to have any perfume. The man didn't understand what she was talking about and said she wanted lavender ones if it could be done. The worker looked at her with a surprised look, but said that unfortunately that was impossible. He couldn't leave her alone in that place. She always had to be watched by someone. However, Down said that if he was so afraid, he could just lock the door. There was certainly no way she was going to open it. The man pondered for a while, then said that was a very good idea. He started to leave and said he would be back quickly, asking her to wait for him here. When he came out, he immediately locked the door and went to fetch the perfume as the girl had asked. Dawn, in turn, as soon as she heard the footsteps subside, immediately ran to the window and opened the doors. She had perfectly thought out the plan already, so when she saw the bars, she wasn't upset. The girl took some sheets from a bed that lay nearby and began to fasten them together to make a long rope. Then she tied one of the ends to the bars and threw the rest away. Dayon climbed up on the windowsill, and because she was thin enough, she was able to climb over the bars. However, as she was doing so, she didn't notice that one small piece had fallen off her dress and dropped to the floor. The girl was able to descend to the ground very quickly, but she did it silently, so that no one would notice her. As soon as her feet were on the ground, she immediately didn't hesitate and ran towards the forest. Down realized that she always had it like this, just when she was starting to think that things were finally getting better and everything was fine. And then she'd end up having to run away anyway. The girl realized that as long as she was alive, it wasn't over. Even though sometimes she thought it was easier to die, she still had one reason for her to live. Dayon was as careful as possible to hide behind the trees when someone saw her, and found a small hole near the wall, which was exactly what she was looking for. The girl thought about the fact that even if she became an old and hunched old woman, she still had an obligation to live on. After all, that was her promise to her dead mother. When she was able to get through the wall, she took one last look at the castle she had spent most of her time in. She didn't look long because someone might notice her, so she quickly said goodbye mentally to him and ran the other way. Dayon had to leave Dalbury Castle, which means she once again has no place to find peace. And now she has no place to start smiling again. It didn't go the way she wanted it to. Soon afterward, the worker of the house, when he returned to the room, saw that it was quite empty. Then he went at once to the master and told him the whole story. Gwyn, who was sitting in his study drinking wine, asked in surprise how she had managed to escape. The man explained that he had left her briefly to fetch perfume, and when he returned she was no longer in the room. The lord sighed heavily and set his glass on the table, motioning for the guards to find her. Then he began to shout loudly, telling them to do something, to have the soldiers search every corner of the castle and be sure to find her. The guards immediately began running out of the hall, following the lord's orders, and he in turn shouted for them to find her no matter what. Soon afterward, the assistant, when he heard about the whole situation, he immediately came to the master to help him in case of anything. He said that maybe it was for the best after all. With a woman like that, it was hard to really manage, and he said that it would be best for the gentleman to just forget about her and find someone else. Gwyn looked at him angrily and wondered in a cold voice if the guy was trying to order him around. But the aide was already used to this state of mind of the lord, so he said in a calm voice that this girl was too smart, and it was dangerous to keep such a girl around. Who knows when she might betray him for her own gain. He also said that she probably only ran away because she realized she wouldn't be able to control him. He said that the man didn't look like Dalbury or Alvin, Gwyn interrupted him and told him to just find her. The boy was about to object. However, he grabbed his hand and said that he was not going to repeat himself several times. Then the aide bowed and said he would be done, and he in turn poured himself another glass of wine. Then he looked at the assistant and said he wanted them to give it back to him right away. But he was so angry that he started clutching the glasses hard, and the glass even cracked. But soon the servants came to them, and they bowed at once, and the master looked at them angrily and asked what was the matter. One of the maids said that this girl had been living with them for 7 years, and none of them knew where she might have gone, and the man was incredibly annoyed. The servants immediately bowed once more and in trembling voices asked for his forgiveness. They said they had done it on purpose. The assistant glimpsed at the lord and sighed heavily, and told the others to leave. The house staff immediately obeyed him, because they didn't want to get into trouble. Gwyn turned away from him and said in a quiet voice that even from the beginning she had planned to flee this place. Then he turned to the guy and asked if there was any news, but he replied that there was nothing yet. After that, he just got up from his seat and went somewhere towards the exit, without saying anything to the assistant, who was just confused by what was happening. Soon after, Gwyn decided to take charge of the operation himself, and went with the rest of the knights to search for the girl. He was very serious because he really wanted to find her, so people, some, were also with dogs to pick up her trail. The men drove through the woods at night, constantly shouting her name for her to hear them. However, Assistant Gwyn simply rode in silence, for he had no desire to participate in this. Gwyn was surprised that this mysterious woman was hiding from the king's specially trained soldiers, and even whole squads of trained warriors couldn't find her. He didn't know where she could have gone. After all, the area wasn't that big, and they still hadn't found just one girl. But his musings were soon distracted by an assistant, who said that the sun was beginning to rise, so he suggested that he return to the castle. Gwyn looked around in surprise and wondered if it had really been that long already. But then he suddenly laughed and thought about the fact that she probably wasn't the kind of woman who would give up so easily, and that amused him even more. Soon, as they were about to turn around and head back, a guard popped out of the forest, addressing the lord. He was very alarmed, and as he came closer to him, he said that they had received a signal in the northeast of the Cerberus forest. They immediately ran over there, and one of the guards started yelling for the girl to stop, because they weren't going to hurt her. Dawn kept running, however. When she saw him, she stopped. Her legs were all bruised and scratched because she had not stopped, and had even walked on various sharp bushes. The guard stopped in front of her and, pointing his hands forward, asked her not to move, for it would be better for her. He himself, in turn, examined the girl from head to toe and noticed that she was covered in satis, but he couldn't understand why she was so desperate to escape. At that moment there were more footsteps behind her, and the other guards came up. They surrounded the girl so that she would not escape. The man looked at her frightened face, not sure what he was even thinking. He needed to focus on the case. So he turned to Dawn and said in a stern voice that there was nowhere else for her to run, because she was surrounded, and in her condition, she wouldn't be able to get far. He started to come closer to her, and said that she had blood all over her legs, and they needed to be bandaged. However, the girl was immediately frightened and started running away. The guard wasted no time and immediately ran after her, as did everyone else. She tried to speed up, but the girl was too exhausted from such a thing, so she couldn't do it. Soon he caught up with her and grabbed her stomach. She tried to fight back for a while, but then she was tired and realized it was useless. The man had a dead grip on her, so she couldn't even move. He felt her desperately trying to open his arms, but she was having no luck. Then he noticed how her expression suddenly changed. He noticed that she seemed to want to cry. The girl quietly began to say that she hated him and asked him to let her go. She repeated these 2 phrases and tried to get away, but the man held her by the waist very tightly. However, to her surprise, after a while, he suddenly let go of her. But the girl had lost too much strength, so she started to fall. He managed to intercept her so that she would not fall to the ground. Rob lifted her into his arms. She was completely unconscious. He stared at her pretty face for a while, unsure of what to do. Then he suddenly heard a horse neighing, and a gentleman descended from it, who was watching the 2 of them intently. Gwyn stepped closer to the guard and reached out his arms to take the girl to him. He held her tightly, making her feel comfortable. When he saw the guard's judgmental look, He told him not to even think about looking at him that way. Then he sighed heavily and added that he usually took her head off, but this time he would have mercy on her. With that, the man turned around and began to walk back to his horse. The guard in turn bowed. It was really hard for him, because his assistant had said that he would have to kill this girl. That's how much the gentleman prevented him from doing it. The man himself knew that this woman was too dangerous for the Lord, so he wasn't going to pass the vice assistant and really wanted to do it. Soon, as Dawn began to regain consciousness, it surprised her. She looked around and found herself in a huge cage with only a single candle to light the room. When the man saw that she was awake, he moved closer to her and, smiling an evil smile, inquired about her being there. But the girl didn't answer anything. Then he called her an idiot and asked her how she dared to reject him even when he loved her so much, and who she thought she was. He then cut the chain from the cage, and the girl fell to the ground with a clatter. She had not expected such a thing, but the man laughed and told her to listen to him carefully. He came close to the cage and said that she would love him. Dawn realized at that moment that this wasn't just a man. He was some kind of wild beast, and people don't behave like that. And she wasn't going to talk to animals. The man opened the lock at that moment to let her out and do what he was going to do. He said in a quiet voice that she could continue to play hard to get, but that he was going to touch her that day. Dawn was very frightened. She didn't want this to happen, and the man started reaching his huge and dirty hands right toward her. And every time in such difficult situations, the girl remembered the words of her mother, who said that she was sure to squeeze for their sake. At that moment, the girl felt that she was directly suffocating from all her emotions. But she managed to possess herself with herself and kicked him right in the face. Because of this, the man lost vigilance and fell to the ground, and she managed to run out. It was the first time she had ever been able to escape like that. She had no brother or father alive, and she knew that soon she would be finished. In fact, all this was not happening in the present. All these events were scrolling in her head like memories. And the girl still, after a while, awoke with horror, thinking that she would definitely not obey this terrible man. When Dawn opened her eyes, she realized that she was relatively safe after all. But then suddenly she heard a man's voice beside her. The girl immediately turned to the side upon hearing the question of whether she was awake. Gwyn was lying next to her, of course, and watching intently. The man had his shirt unbuttoned to the waist, and when he saw her face, he smiled happily, winking at her as well. When he saw that she had already opened her eyes, he wondered, is she finally awake? For a while they just stared at each other in silence, and Dawn didn't know what to say to him. Gwyn was very surprised at this reaction from the girl and said that in fact it was common to yell, or at least be nicely embarrassed under such circumstances. However, she didn't even react to those words in any way, her face completely devoid of any emotion. Then he moved closer to her and inquired, asking if maybe she just hadn't chosen yet. Dawn answered nothing to this for a while, then began to turn away to the other side, in order to avoid looking at the man any longer, and said in a quiet voice that she was in pain. Gwyn, hearing these words, became wary and said that she kept saying it in her sleep too. He turned to the other side and said she was like a dying chick, in a quiet and weak voice, all the while saying she was in pain. Dawn, for her part, followed his gaze and looked at her feet, which were completely bandaged. The girl, seeing this, was very surprised and immediately jumped up from the bed. She was going to run immediately, but she didn't have time to do anything, all because the master was more nimble than she was. He grabbed her arms and threw her back on the bed, holding her down and hovering over her body. However, even after such an awkward and unexpected situation, Dawn didn't show the slightest emotion on her face. He continued to hold her and squeezed her hands tighter with each face, scrutinizing the girl's face. Gwyn's emotions ran wild, so he couldn't stand it and moved closer to the girl. Then he kissed her greedily on the lips. Dawn, of course, didn't like this at all. She started to twist her arms to get out of his grip, but it was no use. Soon she did manage to free at least one arm, and she was able to push his shoulder away. Then the girl immediately rushed to run away from him, far away, for she was not at all pleased with what he was doing. Dawn stopped at the end of the room and glared angrily at him. The girl was already prepared to defend herself in case he ran after her. However, Gwyn, fixing his hair, only sighed heavily. Then he looked playfully at the girl and said that it was very curious. Dawn, quickly looking around the room, ran over to the table that stood next to it and grabbed a knife in order to be able to defend herself if anything happened. She did it so quickly that her hand even grazed the bowl of apples, which is why one rolled out and fell to the floor. Gwyn, for his part, sat quietly on the bed and looked at her in surprise, wondering what she was going to do next. But the girl was serious. Her gaze was already martial, and she held that blade right in front of her to ensure that no one dared to offend her again. Then the man pointed to the seat next to him and asked her to come over. After all, they had a difference in physical strength, so she certainly couldn't do anything to him with that little knife. He also said in a quieter voice that if the rabbit were to somehow grow fangs, it would never be able to defeat the wolf. So it wouldn't even be worth trying. But the moment the man looked away, he heard a great screeching sound. He turned back and saw that the blade was heading straight for his face. Since Gwyn was a military man, he had incredibly good reactions, so he managed to turn away from her blow. The girl herself realized at that moment that she had failed, so she moved the blade straight to her throat. The man, seeing this, suddenly laughed out loud. He slowly got up from the bed and began to walk over to the girl, who continued to hold the blade at her throat. Gwyn looked at her in surprise and wondered if she really wanted to kill herself. Then Dawn finally spoke up and said that not at all. She didn't want to do that. After that, raising her voice a little, she also said that she could survive. Gwyn continued to approach her, and wondered if she shouldn't have aimed the knife at him instead of herself in that case, since she wanted to survive. The girl had already asked, with a challenge, if she understood correctly that he didn't want her to die, which meant that he would back off, and she would live a day longer if she kept the blade at her side like that, threatening her death. The man began to scrutinize the girl and didn't realize if she was bluffing or if she was dead serious, and could actually slit her own throat if need be. Dawn actually looked very convincing, bringing the blade of the blade closer and closer to her throat with each passing second. But at that moment she suddenly heard a noise. Turning to the side, she saw it was Gwyn. He walked over to the table and took a chair from it. The man quickly sat down across from her, and then wondered if she really loved this Alvin. Dawn didn't reply anything to that. Her hands didn't even begin to tremble, but she still felt uncomfortable when he mentioned that name as if it was worthless. The man in turn continued. He said he had been told that she loved him, but he still didn't believe it. They were both silent for a while. Then the girl began to twitch her legs, and afterward, in a quiet voice, said that he was precious to her. Gwyn smiled and said that in that case, he could take her virginity, since he was just precious to her, and they had no love. However, Dawn categorically said that no, she was not going to sleep in the same bed with a man she absolutely dislikes, that's all. She wasn't going to make any concessions, and if he didn't like something, that was his problem. When he heard these words, he suddenly started laughing loudly and said that his pride was now shattered. Gwyn also asked that she just not say such a thing in front of Jafar, for it would be too embarrassing for him. After calming down a little from his laughter, the guy leaned back in his chair and said that if his assistant found out about those words, he would just start making fun of him. But then Gwyn sighed and said, "Okay, so be it." He wondered what she was going to do next, since he really wanted her so much. Of course, there was no reaction from this girl again. She still stood motionless with the blade at her throat. After a while, Dawn did say that she would work at the place as she had before, and asked that he just treat her as if she were a slave, and nothing more she asked. He was very surprised to hear this, and asked if she really wanted him to treat her like a slave. Gwyn didn't understand how she chose to work day and night as a slave instead of receiving delicious food, expensive clothes, and various jewelry. But the girl said that's the kind of person she wanted to be. She didn't want anything else. Then the man hesitated, thinking over all the choices and moves he would have to make, but finally agreed and said that in that case they could play. Gwyn looked at her and smiled and said that she would do what she wanted to do, while he would do what he wanted to do himself. When the girl heard this information, it was very surprised. She was actually completely sure that he would refuse this offer. However, Gwyn continued and also said that about the rules, it would be very simple, not too many, and easy to memorize. In fact, it would only be one. The girl immediately removed the blade from her throat and wondered what that rule would be. He smiled smugly, knowing she had fallen for his tricks after all, then remained silent for a while. Gwyn then said that the rule is that they will not be able to go outside of this castle, and if she suddenly disappears from his sight, he will regret it. For death or life, they have no right to either until they fulfill each other's wishes. Daon listened carefully to his terms and remained silent, pondering whether or not it was even a good offer. When some time had passed, the man inquired if her silence was a sign of agreement and they could proceed with their business already. The girl still didn't say anything. She continued to stand back and put the blade away. Then the man started to get up from his chair and told her to clean his room first. He picked up an apple that the girl had dropped and asked that she prepare an evening snack for him, for he was a little hungry. Gwyn stepped closer to her and placed the apple on the table and said she would sleep in this spot. He felt she had enough space. And without waiting for any response from the girl, he simply walked to the door and followed her out, leaving her alone. Daon actually still couldn't believe that he had just backed off so easily and let her continue to be a slave. When she shifted her gaze to the apple and realized that it could in no way be trusted, her strength immediately left her, so she slumped to the floor. Daon, who had been holding back all this time all her emotions and fear and frustrations when she was alone, could finally let them out. So she hid in her arms and started crying because it was too much for her to bear, and she was already tired of it all. When morning came, the girl went about her daily duties. She went to the dining room and began setting the table to serve breakfast to the master. At this very time, Gwyn, who had taken his morning shower, was already out. He went to the mirror and began to fix his hair after his bath. The man was wearing absolutely no clothes at all, only a towel that covered his lower body. Daon, as soon as she caught a glimpse of him, watched the man with her side vision. But she didn't turn around so that he wouldn't notice. But Gwyn felt someone's gaze on his body, so when he turned around, he saw that she turned away sharply because she saw his gaze. Like this, they stood with their backs to each other for a while and didn't even look at each other. This situation was too tense and awkward. Soon the girl took new clean towels and, walking up to her host, held them out. Gwyn immediately took them and began wiping her body, and then he said, looking at the set table, that she must have gotten used to her job a long time ago. Of course, the girl didn't answer anything to that. She didn't even want to look him in the eyes, so her gaze was directed to the floor. The man in turn thought about the fact that she had actually been working like this for a very long time. Perhaps Old Man Dalbury and Alvin even slept with her at night. What alarmed Gwyn the most, however, was her detached gaze. She looked down at him, as if not paying him any attention at all. It was a terrible Arabian habit in such a beautiful and incredibly beautiful body. It made the man even sadder that she had to go through all this. Then he couldn't stand it. It wasn't enough for him to just look at her. So the man moved closer and pulled her head up and looked her straight in the eyes, then inquired about her legs. Daon, of course, answered nothing. She looked at him with her large and incredibly beautiful eyes, but continued to remain silent. Gwyn was incredibly annoyed by all of this, so he pulled the girl to him and began kissing her greedily on the lips. The maid tried to somehow free herself from his grip. Her legs even began to tremble for fear that he might do something else bad. But there was nothing she could do, for he was indeed stronger. After a while he finally finished kissing her and in a quiet voice told her that next time if he asked, she should answer. Gwyn then released her head and told her that if she wanted to ask him anything, he would be happy to answer any question for her. Gwyn held her by the waist and told her that she could consider it their new rule, and asked that she try to memorize it. He suddenly laughed and said that if she suddenly forgot, he would kiss her all the time when she didn't respond. But actually he didn't even mind, because it felt good to do it. When the man finally let go of her completely, and Daon took a few steps back and said that he had told her he wouldn't touch her, hadn't he? But Gwyn only smiled at that and said that not at all, he would not use her without her own consent. He reached up with his hand and fixed his facial hair, saying that she might consider that a very nice rule for her, for he could have done more, but didn't. Daon was still silently just staring at him. In fact, there were many different thoughts in her head, but not a single emotion on her face. Soon the man finally got tired of her silence and turned around and said that if she didn't like it, she could change those rules. But then the girl finally spoke up and said no. After that, they went their separate ways and didn't see each other all day. When evening came, the sun had already begun to go below the horizon, and Gwyn was dressed in his military uniform. The man went into the library, which contained many different books, and called for his assistant, Jafar. He was sitting at a table, writing on a huge parchment. He asked, seeing the gentleman's appearance, if he had been out exploring the neighborhood. Gwyn replied that that was exactly what he was doing, and also added that Orang was not such a rich land as he had previously thought. His assistant started to get up from the table and said that everything is absolutely correct. There are no mines in this place that you can even make money from. Of course, there is a large forest. However, the local soil is in no way suitable for agriculture, so it is a very unprofitable place. The tired Gwyn sat down on the sofa and said that he had conquered these lands just to see how the king would react. However, he didn't even think that the lands in this place would be so terrible. Jafar stepped closer to him and held out a slip of paper, saying he had a letter from Prince Zak. He wanted to come to celebrate the capture of Orang. Gwyn immediately took the scroll and turned around, very surprised that he wanted to come to celebrate. He was thinking about something, for one very important detail caught his attention. In fact, old man Dalbury never took sides. He had his own opinion all the time and didn't support anyone. But other vassals actively took advantage of it, and got rich with the help of his such naivety. Then Gwyn asked the assistant when this prince was going to arrive. The man replied that it would be early next month, so they had about a week more. He said that before that time they had to get rid of all the useless people in the estate. The assistant was not very happy about this instruction, but he had no choice, so he said that they would do everything. Then suddenly one of the knights entered their room. Turning to the lord when Gwyn saw him, he immediately remembered what he had to do. The man stepped closer to him and handed him a rolled-up scroll. Then Gwyn said they had another report coming out. He immediately unfolded it and began to scrutinize it. When Gwyn saw everything written on this list, he was incredibly surprised and wondered if it had all been done in just one day. However, the knight said that it was the lord's own fault, for he had loaded the girl with so much work. But Gwyn was shocked that she woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning to start doing her work. He couldn't believe that the slave girl was actually doing this. Even owls don't wake up that early. Then he began to read further down the list, and saw that in half an hour there was garden cleaning, and then the kitchen work would take an hour. And after cooking, she would clean the castle. The man didn't understand how it was possible to accomplish this whole list of chores in just a mere 2 hours. After laundry and lunch, she has to wash all the dishes. Then dinner, again the dishes, and after that the kitchen cleaning. The rest of the time the girl spends in her room sewing. Once for the ball she even embroidered her second wife's dress, and it was all done in one night. Gwyn read it all, put the paper aside, and wondered angrily if no one in the entire castle was helping her at all. When the knight replied that unfortunately she was not asking for help, the man inquired as to how long she had been working in such a crazy mode. But no one answered, for they didn't know the truth. Gwyn said that everyone must have hated her, because she was somehow close to Dalbury. The knight in turn said that she seemed to have been able to handle this amount of work for a long time, and never complained. The lord in turn asked if she even had time to eat with such a crazy schedule. Knight thought for a moment, and afterward said that he had recently seen her eating lunch, so he thought she was making time. Soon afterward, Gwyn immediately asked to invite her to his office. And soon the girl knocked, and he allowed her to enter. When Daon came in, he saw that she had some food in her hands, as well as alcohol. The man realized that there was no point in asking her if she was eating normally at all, because the answer would have been obvious. If the girl had a normal diet, she wouldn't be so skinny, and her skin wouldn't be so white. He reflected on the fact that even though she was a slave, the girl might well have been Dalbury's mistress, or Alvin's, or both of them. However, they decided not to say anything about it, and for the treatment of his second wife, who had just a disgusting character. But really it's all obvious, because stupid men don't get involved in women's problems. In this place, for the first time, this girl is not being treated as badly as before, so she must have mistaken this care for true love. Daon, in turn, had already placed the food on his table and began pouring wine. The man waved his hand at the knight, saying with just his lips that he could go now. He knew that even if the house was very quiet, she still didn't find peace. If only the people at fault would intervene, things could even be solved. They thought it best to ignore it, but the problems only grew bigger as time went on, and in the end, she only found it harder to cope with all the responsibilities that fell on her fragile shoulders. When the girl had finished preparing dinner for the master, he suddenly turned to her and told her to sit next to him. The assistant, who was returning to his table, was very surprised to hear this. He didn't understand how the master could give permission for the slave to sit next to and even eat the same food that the master would eat. He was ready to scream with his rage, for this behavior was totally unacceptable. A slave sitting where her master is actually a serious offense, so he really wished Gwyn would reconsider her decision. But the man only smiled and waited for her to sit down. However, the aide realized that if the girl disobeyed, it would also be a crime. So he wondered what she would choose, and so did Gwynna. Dawn just stood silently for a while. But after that, she realized that the best decision would be to accept his order. So she walked around the table to the other side and sat down on the chair next to it. Gwyn covered his mouth with his hand at this point so she wouldn't see his smile, for he was actually a little surprised. And so they were worth doing, for they have her very brave, so of course he agreed to such a request. Even without any weapons, she still stood up to him. He thought of this girl as a straight-up femme fatale, and of course he was only beginning to like her more. Dawn in turn began to slowly peel the apple with a completely indifferent look on her face, as if she were offered to sit next to an aristocrat every day. At this point the man was not happy with her being so far away from him, so he grabbed her chair leg and started pulling her as close to him as possible. In a second she was in front of the gentleman. The girl was a little surprised, but continued to sit with the sliced apple. Gwyn took one slice and pulled it up. He then asked the slave to open her mouth. He brought the apple right up to her face so she could taste it. The girl answered nothing to that. Then Gwyn smiled and asked her to keep her mind on their game. He likes to watch a woman's lips move, so he urged her to do so. He was about to say some more vulgar thing, but then the assistant realized where he was going and started coughing loudly for the master to finally stop. Dawn paid no attention to him, but then she still had to fix herself a little, and she opened her mouth a little. The man, when he saw this, asked her to open it wider. The girl had nothing else to do, so she opened her mouth wide to fit the apple and took a small bite out of it. Dawn slowly began to chew this apple and even smiled a little, for indeed its flavor was so intense, and she had never eaten such beautiful apples in her life. Gwyn, when he saw this, smiled happily and said that it was all wonderful. Then he took a piece of bread and began to spread jam on it, saying that the next thing she would eat would be this. When everything was ready, he brought the piece of bread to her mouth. The slave had nothing else to do, so she took a bite of the food, just as she had with the apple. However, because the jam was very sticky and there was a lot of it, her lips got dirty. She immediately started licking them because she was uncomfortable with the jam on her lips. Gwyn watched her eagerly, not realizing that she was really trying to tease him. But it annoyed him, and he couldn't help it. Then the man suddenly took her hand and held it close to his face. He looked at her palm, which was all red. Gwyn realized her hands were all calloused. She looked provocative, but her hands were just plain redneck, so small they looked like they might break if you squeezed her a little. Then he let go of her hand after all, and told her to bring meat from tomorrow. He smiled and also added that he wanted to see that beautiful juice running down her lips. They would be red and lush and wet. But at that moment he was interrupted by an assistant who came up to them with various scrolls and coughed for the gentleman to finally stop. The assistant handed him the papers and told him it was a job for tomorrow. Gwyn looked at him angrily, for he had interrupted his conversation. And at that very moment the girl had already gotten up and walked straight out the door without even saying goodbye. She was as uncomfortable as possible to be there. Jafar looked at him and asked in surprise why the Lord had not stopped her. But the man sighed heavily and said that in fact she could not be stopped just like that. Then the aide said that the orang actually surrendered without a fight, but this girl apparently doesn't want to. Gwyn took the wineglass and began to drink, and the assistant said that for now he had free time, so he could play with women. However, let him do it in moderation, for he might overdo it, and he also had his own work for the master to do. The man looked at his assistant in surprise and asked if he had the nerve to tell off his boss. Jafar immediately said that this girl was very dangerous, so he asked that the Lord should not simply succumb to her charms and always be on guard. Gwyn then said a few words to his assistant, and they talked over their various affairs for some time longer. And soon after, Gwyn brought out a small box of jewelry and presented it to the girl. She, without showing a single emotion, just stared at it blankly. The man in turn wondered why she was so sad, and asked if she didn't like his gift. He actually gave her an excellent gold bracelet that was also encrusted with various precious stones. Daon just stood next to that box and said that it certainly wouldn't fit her. The man immediately realized that she probably just wanted to give it up. Therefore, he smiled. Then Gwyn turned to her, and as he continued to gather himself, he said that it would be up to him, but not her. But the girl continued to insist. She didn't even want to look the gentleman in the eye and said that she had nowhere to wear it, so it was just a waste of money. But Gwyn inquired why not, for she could wear it to the ball. But the girl immediately replied that she did not go to such events. But he wasn't going to hear any rejection, so he said that in that case she would go this year. So she would definitely have to accept the bracelet. Daon answered nothing to that. She didn't even want to look at the man or the gift, so she just looked down. Gwyn told her to take it away, since he certainly wouldn't need it. But the girl said she had no place to keep it in her room. The man wondered if Alvin and Old Man Dalberry had never given their mistress anything, since she still had no jewelry box. However, not waiting for an answer, he asked if maybe she was just interested in much more expensive gifts, which was why she still didn't have any jewelry. Daon wasn't going to listen to all this humiliation, so she bowed and said that she would be on her way in that case. Gwyn in turn thought to himself that, yes, we of the royal palace would have clawed each other's eyes out for such a beautiful and expensive gift. And this girl merely dismissed it as a mere pebble, even though it wasn't very expensive. Although the bracelet is actually incredibly precious. Gwyn walked over to the table and, slamming the lid shut, realized that this girl was the kind of girl who wasn't interested in expensive jewelry. But it was still a mystery to him then what she might like. Gwyn smiled as he thought about it, and thought that gradually he would make her his. And sooner or later the girl will have to give up anyway, and he still has plenty of time because the game is just beginning, so there's no way he's giving up. Shortly afterward, when Gwyn returned from his rounds, an assistant came up to him and told him some very important news. The man was surprised and asked if the second wife's ring had really been found in Daon's room. Jafar said that everything was absolutely correct, for he had been so given this information. According to the maid, many people's belongings went missing all the time, and everything that was lost during this time was always found in Daon's room. And on this day the things in the second wife's room were missing again. They were found again in the maid's room. When Gwyn heard this, he was alarmed. He turned to the maid standing nearby and wondered if this was really the first time something like this had happened. The woman immediately bowed, and waving her head, said that it was right, because this kind of thing had happened all the time before. The aide handed him 2 rings and said that some people were saying that these were proof. When Gwyn saw them, he realized that these rings were indeed the rings his second wife had been wearing when she met him. Then he asked Jafar to gather all those who worked in that castle in one place. The man immediately said that he would do everything and ran with a summons to do his bidding. Some time had passed since then, and Jafar was following the Lord, saying that he and the knight had interviewed the maids and other attendants, and all said the same thing. The thefts had happened more than once, and each time only the slave's name came up. It was always found only in her room. Gwyn was very wary when he heard this, but still he had a definite idea of this girl, so he doubted the correctness of the statement. Soon all the servants of the house were gathered in one place, and were waiting for the Lord so that he could talk to them. As soon as the man entered the hall, they immediately began to worship. He saw Daon in the back of the crowd, standing behind them so that no one would pay attention to her. Gwyn walked to the end of the hall and took his seat. Then he called the head maid over to him. The girl was a little surprised, but she ran to him at once. The man said that such matters were usually handled according to the customs of the castle, and asked how the late Earl of Dalberry had handled the situation. Most importantly, the maid immediately said that it was customary to whip and cut off wrists for such things. However, the Count eventually abolished these punishments. Gwyn asked what punishments he had thought of in lieu of these. The maid said that for a week a man like that would be locked in solitary confinement and fed nothing. Then in a quieter voice she said that even so, this girl still hadn't stopped stealing. The maid turned to the master and asked that he choose a harsher punishment this time, so that she would finally understand her place. Gwyn at this point said that she had given up the bracelet worth a huge amount of gold coins that he had given her, and he looked at all those servants and wondered, do they really think that in doing so, she stole cheap jewelry for a few silver coins for her own gain? He sighed heavily and looked at the maid and turned away. He noticed that the girl was still silent, and even in this situation, she didn't seem to care what happened. She doesn't even want to defend herself. This girl's face was emotionless, as if she were a walking corpse. It was so relaxed and empty that it made you shiver when you saw it. For a while, the Gwyn just sat there silent, but then he said, well, since there was a thief among them, we should cut off his hands. When the head maid heard this beautiful punishment, she was very happy and told the master that he had chosen the right decision. The man, in turn, watching her facial expression, realized that she was unnaturally pleased that an innocent girl was probably about to have both her hands chopped off. The other men lined up and just bowed to the master. He didn't realize that no one would even stand up for the girl, and she'd worked side by side with them for so many years. In fact, at that moment when the Lord was sitting in the study with his assistant, then Jafar said that this girl was very dangerous, and asked that the Lord should not lose his head being around her. After all, it might be too irresponsible. But Gwyn, in his turn, having finished his wine, asked his assistant what he himself thought, whether he could have worked so hard without any rest. And he wouldn't even look tired. Not only that, but he wouldn't complain or skip work. Wouldn't even try to get a performance bonus somehow. And at this very time he would, for all that, not even enjoy the job. Gwyn turned away from him and said, "This is all very strange." The man agreed with him and said that it was really just crazy. Gwyn replied that it wasn't really that she was emotionless, but that she could control herself perfectly in any situation, even one that was out of her control. Therefore, the man would definitely not call such a person dangerous. However, the assistant still insisted and said that she was indeed dangerous to the Gwyn, after all. He only smiled at that and said that since that was the case, he didn't mind her being dangerous, and wondered if his assistant could remember the last time he'd even run away from danger. Jafar said that he certainly didn't run, but he simply had no instinct for self-preservation. The man laughed and said that was perfectly well said, and the assistant sighed heavily and replied that he was glad that at least the gentleman agreed with him. They were silent for a while, and when the Gwyn poured himself another round of wine, he said that there were a lot of people in this place who hated Daon. There would soon be someone who would want to stab her in the back. He also added that one will just have to be prepared for such a turnaround in order not to screw anyone over. At that moment, Daon stepped into the middle of the hall, and the man asked for her to explain herself from her side. But the girl, as usual, said nothing. She stood with her head down and didn't even want to defend herself. Gwyn concluded from her demeanor that she must have gotten used to it long ago. He said that she had a chance for vindication now, and then wondered if she might prefer to lose her head. But the maid didn't even reply to that. She didn't even look at the master to see his face, to see if he was serious or not. The man realized at that moment that she probably thought that even saying something would make absolutely no difference at all. She probably thinks that no one would believe a slave, and a foreigner at that. And that's why she doesn't even try to defend herself in such a situation, when she's being slandered. Gwyn was silent for a while. Afterward, he looked at her and asked, "Does she really want to die?" The man became even angrier and asked that she say just one word, "No," and then it would all stop. He continued to stare at her. At this point, Daon was already interested in the situation, so she even raised her gaze and stared back at him. However, she simply remained silent for a while. But when she saw the Lord's fierce gaze, she realized that he meant it. So she said in a quiet voice that she didn't want to die. When the man was about to say something, she continued and added that she had never stolen and would never do such a thing. The girl explained that she didn't need all that jewelry at all, so there was no point in her stealing from the gentleman. Gwyn, when he heard this, did not seem pleased. He only asked in a cold voice that she come closer to him and held out his hand. Daon stood for a while, but then she began to walk slowly toward his throne, And when she was close enough, the man suddenly took her hand. And at that moment, something happened that neither the audience nor the girl expected. He picked her up in his arms and sat her on his lap. Dawn was so surprised that her eyes bulged. She didn't think the Lord would sit her on his lap and put his arm around her. She thought he would not believe her right now and cut off her head as he had promised. But at that moment, Gwyn looked angrily at all the workers of the house and asked that they watch carefully until he gouged out all of their eyes. Then he spoke more calmly and said that this girl was his woman and they were in his castle. Everything inside it belonged to him alone. Gwyn said that's why this girl could steal anything she wanted, and it wouldn't be a crime. Then he looked at all those present in the room with a glance and asked if the condition was clear to them. All the servants immediately bowed, which meant that they understood everything and would never go against the master again. And he in turn said that if they suddenly came to him again with the same problem, he would punish them the way Dawn was living. The head maid was so scared that her whole body even started to shake, while the slave continued to sit on his lap and only watch the whole thing from the side. Then the man said that since they were all already gathered in this room, he thought another matter could be discussed. Dawn, hearing those words, had already tried to remove his hand in order to get off, but he put it back on her shoulder and said quietly that he was sure she was going to have fun now. Then Gwyn said that from the head maid to the common servants, not only theft flourished in this place, but bribery flourished as well. He turned to his knight and motioned for him to begin. At that moment, the man in uniform unrolled the scroll he had been holding in his hands all this time. He began to read. It said that Phaeton had given 3 silver coins and 2 chickens to Colon Sloane, the head maid, to hire him. Then he also paid 2 silver coins to Hans Tamer, and was exempted from paying taxes. Hans also received 2 silver coins from the cook and the head maid, so that they too would be exempt from taxes. Also, often when recruiting new servants, people would bribe with cattle or grain just to be hired. Thomas Muller, the head cook, was constantly changing suppliers. In turn, the suppliers paid him personally in gold coins or flour. Jerry Wall, a tax evader last year, paid quite a lot of coin. The man continued reading for a while longer. It stretched on for a good half hour, because every servant in the house worked only for a certain bribe. Soon he finally finished. Turning to the gentleman, he said that he had announced the entire list of crooks, bribers, and tax evaders. Gwyn, who had been sitting with the girl in his arms the whole time so far, waved his head in acknowledgement. He turned to the head maid and asked her what she had said earlier. His assistant, who was standing nearby, noticed that the gentleman was glowing with happiness. The man, in turn, asked if he remembered correctly that the perpetrators had been beaten and their wrists cut off. The workers of the house immediately began to fall to the ground and beg the master to forgive them. After all, they did not want to do such a thing. The people said they were sorry and asked for his mercy. They said they had a very hard life, so there was simply no choice. They couldn't work if he suddenly cut off their wrists, so the servants asked him to spare them at least this time. One worker said he still had a family to feed. Others said their children were starving, so they had to make do. Dawn at this time finally got off the Lord's lap. He looked at them angrily and told them to shut up. Gwyn said a special observer would be stationed in each village and he would be sure to take a census. The way of taxation will change, and they will not pay by trees, but by the number of members in the families. In fact, another purpose of the census is to determine the number of men who can be used as soldiers. But in any case, the results of the survey will be very useful to Gwyn. At that moment he glimpsed the girl, who stood meekly beside him and looked down again. Then the man sighed and told the knights to already behead those whose names were on that list. When the perpetrators heard this, they were very surprised and upset. They begged the master even more loudly to have mercy on them and not let them die like this. They asked that Gwyn just forgive them and said it would never happen again. It was just a mistake. The man was about to say something to them, but suddenly he heard Dawn speak to him. She asked him not to do it. Gwyn looked at her in surprise, not realizing that she was really asking him to do that. But in that moment, he thought about it and realized that this would actually be a good opportunity. Perhaps he could help her improve her reputation among the other servants. So he began to play his part. The man turned to her angrily and told her not to show them charity. But the girl persisted in her insistence. She said that the Earl of Dalbury had recently died, and that his wife and the young master were also dead. And she asked if now he also wanted to slaughter all those poor servants in the castle. Daeon explained that the people of Arank were already feeling terribly uncomfortable with such a drastic change in power, and if he did so, they would simply begin to fear him. The girl looked him straight in the eye with her confident gaze. She was sure he would listen to her. Gwyn was silent for a while. Then he pointed to the servants and said that they had said that criminals deserved to be punished. But the girl said that if he really did that, the locals might go against him. They would revolt because of such an attitude. Gwyn glimpsed at her and said that in that case they would execute the servants who did break the law, and the locals would only get better at it that way. Dawn said that Aranka is a fairly small area, and many of these servants have families outside the castle walls, so what happens inside will be known outside the castle as well. He wondered in surprise if she really thought they would be angered by the just punishments of these people. The girl said it would look as if the invaders had come to the castle and set up only their own rules, ignoring everything else. At that moment, the man thought about it and realized that she was actually right about that, and he could finally understand her temperament. Gwyn smiled happily and asked the girl if she liked politics. In fact, he decided to play this role of an evil policeman in order to be treated better. However, he ended up finding something more interesting to do. When the man asked this question, Dan was very surprised, but she immediately looked away from him and answered nothing. The girl began to worry. When Gwyn saw her behavior, he knew he had hit the jackpot, but he didn't know what to do now. If he takes and executes the criminals, this woman will also continue to hide her feelings and live her renounced life. And if he lets them live, he can move her a little closer to him on the chessboard. She might even trust him. Gwyn sighed heavily and said, turning to the servants, that it would be much easier if they just executed them all. He also said that they could simply be driven out of the city. However, this would not solve the second problem, because they need labor. He hesitated and said that in that case, they would have to make it so that the men would work at repairing the castle and the roads, and the women in turn would work in the inns that were near the construction work. He turned to all the workers who were still kneeling and could already exhale with relief, telling them to be grateful to this girl, for she had just saved all their lives. His assistant began to collect the papers, and said that it was very merciful of him. In fact, he was really surprised at the gentleman's decision. Gwyn said he would have to tell the king about such a favor of his to the king sometime, and asked the aide if he agreed with his opinion. He didn't have time to answer anything, however, because Gwyn had said himself that he probably wouldn't even believe it. At that moment, the man heard someone suddenly start laughing. He turned to the side and saw that it was the knight. The man immediately became very nervous, realizing that if the lord found out that he had started laughing at his words, he would not feel very good. Gwyn, however, decided to turn his attention to the girl. He moved closer to her and, raising her gaze to his, asked her what she liked to do in her spare time. Dawn pondered her answer for a while. Then in a quiet voice, she said that she liked to cook. He stepped aside and said that in that case she would be in charge of the kitchen from that day forward, and asked that she remember one very important thing. Gwyn touched her face gently and said that now she had one job that he had given her, and everything else she would not do, and asked if that was clear to her. He also said she would be the head chef with all the powers one could have. He thought at this point that her situation should now improve, but he did not hear the negotiations with the hatchlings, who had heard that the slave would now be present in the kitchen. They considered the whole thing an outrage, even though she had saved their lives from execution. But then suddenly the man wouldn't let her go and said he had another question. Gwyn asked what she would do if they banished or executed the culprits, and servants would clearly be in short supply in such a case. The girl was silent for a while. She didn't know what to say and lowered her gaze again, but the man insisted and asked her to answer his question. Then Dawn said in a quiet voice that his census was leaving out too much. Therefore, the criteria should be broadened, and everything else should be taken into account. The man was surprised and asked what she even meant by the rest. Then the girl replied that it included the number of people over 15, the number of children who could work, and so on. After all this census, you can select suitable roomers from them, pay them a weekly wage, also give them the opportunity to earn extra depending on the amount of work. When Gwyn heard that one, he smiled. He said that was a pretty good idea, so that's what they would do. When the girl heard that someone had listened to her idea, she was even very surprised, and she didn't bother to hide her surprise on her face. At that moment, the man turned and thought about the fact that this girl obviously likes politics. That is why she's so indifferent to all jewelry and everything related to it in general. Gwyn stepped closer to her and thought that if he gave her a chance to prove herself, he might even be able to use her. The man leaned over and said in her ear that she had said she would only open the gate to the ruler. In fact, that was indeed true, for when he had not yet taken the city, he had received a letter in a woman's handwriting that said the gate would open only to the ruler. He smiled and said that he knew exactly how to open her gate. Dawn, of course, didn't say anything, just stood there without any emotion. After a while, the assistant ran after the gentleman in the morning with a huge amount of various papers and said that road building is a big pile of work after all. Gwyn didn't listen to him, only went on about his business. He was annoyed at how much his assistant was worrying about all this. Jafar says it's not too late. He asked that the man give up this horrible road construction. The gentleman paused for a while, contemplating what to answer him, and then told him to shut up and just count all the costs. The man was about to object but didn't have time because Gwyn said that good roads would make life easier for the locals as well as themselves, and didn't understand why the guy was so against it. They walked on, and the gentleman also said that he had seen what was going on outside the road, and in this case, just a necessity. Jafar asked if they had not decided too quickly to take such a huge and responsible step. Gwyn looked out the window and said that might be true. He heard some noise out there. Then the aide looked behind him and said it was their soldiers and Dalbury's soldiers. He looked at the gentleman who had a rather concerned face and wondered what was even going on there. Gwyn, however, turned around and started to walk away. Jafar immediately ran after him and said that of course this was now their territory and they could do what they wanted. But they were already in the place by someone else's roads, something to maintain. He said it was too proactive a ruling, in which case not only the king but other lords might begin to fear a threat from them. He also added that their misgivings could even turn into a conflict in the future, and so he asked that the man really reconsider and think about all these points. But Gwyn asked that he stop saying all this already. He said that they could take their time for now, for they needed something to keep the people occupied. At that moment, he looked out the window and whistled to one of the knights, then pointed in a direction for him to go there. The knight immediately bowed and went about his business, and Gwyn said it was all just for his amusement. Then he smiled and turned to the aide and said that he had always lived like this and did whatever he wanted to do. He looked away and said that building roads is just a way to kill unnecessary time, so it's all very simple. Jafar, who had stopped a few meters away from him, said in surprise that everyone was already afraid of him, and he did not understand what the gentleman was trying to achieve by such drastic actions. Gwyn thought for a moment and answered nothing. Then the aide said that he already had to reduce the number of soldiers in order not to provoke the king. If the king brought his army here, they would be in trouble. But Gwyn told him not to worry, for their army was small but elite. But the man thought the Lord was just too naive and frivolous. For a while, Jafar just stared at him, and then he realized that this was definitely all about Dawn. He thought that this girl was affecting him very much, even at this stage. He thought for a while about whether or not he should tell the Lord about it, but then he pulled himself together and said that they had new information about Dawn. Gwyn was immediately interested and looked at his assistant and told him to speak up. The man replied that it seemed that this girl had tried to talk Alvin into running away. The man didn't understand what the catch was, it was obvious. But Jafar insisted and said that the Lord just didn't understand. They wanted to escape together. On the day of the Earl of Dalbury's death, while everyone was insulting and dividing the inheritance, this woman was making a special plan to escape. Plus, the aide said she told everyone that there was a high probability that they would invade the orang. So, when Gwyn heard that, he hesitated. But after that, he smiled and sighed heavily. In fact, his girlfriend at this moment began to be more and more interested in him. His assistant, in turn, continued the story and said that as soon as the Count died, as she predicted the invasion, wanted to run away with her eldest son. She is definitely an unusual woman who has an unknown what is in her head in general. But suddenly Gwyn spoke up and said that Alvin hadn't run away, had he? Then the man explained that John didn't know what the second wife would do, so she had stayed at the manor after all. He also said that if they were in a romantic relationship, she was understandable. As soon as Gwyn heard this information, he found his fist hard. It annoyed him that she might actually be in love with Alvin. But Jafar continued. He had already raised his voice and said that this woman was a very dangerous person, and she could even read her opponent. Before he could say anything, Gwyn said, "That's right. This girl is exactly like that. She's cold and very smart." At that moment he sat down on the window and began to look somewhere in the distance. The man was silent for a while, and after looking at the guards who were walking around protecting the castle, he said that for all that, she was also a slave. He wondered how such a thing was even possible. After all, he had never met a girl like that before. Jafar said that slaves actually have a position no better than livestock, and she can never be a concubine. By law, she can't even always be a mistress. Gwyn looked at him in surprise and asked what the big deal was. The assistant thought at that moment that until now he had always respected his master's wish. However, this time he must definitely stop him, for he was making a huge mistake. So he turned to him and said in a quiet voice that he knew perfectly well what he thought. 5 months ago, the second son of Baron Bendel of Sprout was executed because he had had an affair with a slave girl. Jafar said, his head still hanging outside the castle gates. He has enough enemies, more than anyone else. And if Gwyn ever lets her guard down, she's sure to stab him in the back. The deputy said she hates him because he took and executed her beloved Alvin. So he also asked that the Lord think about what would happen to the girl if she fell into the hands of another lord. So Jafar asked that he should get rid of her as soon as possible, for it might be too dangerous. Gwyn was silent for a while. Then, with a heavy sigh, he said that he understood perfectly well what the man wanted to tell him. At that moment, however, he looked out the window and saw a girl dressed in a uniform coming out of the back door. He didn't understand why she wasn't sitting still, because she was doing something again. He sat silently watching Dayon for a while, then quietly said that she was just some stupid woman who didn't want to worry about her health and well-being. His assistant sighed heavily and told the gentleman that he didn't think the man could simply refuse. Gwyn kept watching the girl, who was walking somewhere to the side, and then he still said that he wouldn't quit. She would only be his, so there was no point in persuading anymore. At this time, Dayon had already returned to the kitchen again, and was doing her duties there. She was quite tired, but still she didn't take any breaks and continued to do her work. And so, as she was about to take off her hat, she suddenly saw a gentleman standing near the entrance, watching her intently. The sun was already beginning to set outside, and Gwyn was actually standing there looking at the girl. After a while, the man also said that he had warned her not to go outside the castle walls and asked where she was going. Dayon lowered her gaze and said that there wasn't enough food at the construction site right now, so she wanted to bring it so that work wouldn't stop and people could continue. However, the man came closer to her and said in a gruff voice that it wasn't her job after all. Gwyn said that if she takes away another person's job, she's interfering in their life, and once she gets to a certain position, she'll need to get used to using people. So right now, it's totally irrelevant to bring people food. The girl did not want to look at him, but he kept coming closer and said that it was for her and her subordinates. She should have some authority among the others. They stood in silence for a while, and when the man had already turned around and was about to leave, he heard the voice of the maid saying, "Okay," she agreed, stood still for a while longer, then sat down on the hay that was nearby, and then lay down on it altogether. He glimpsed her and snapped his fingers. Dayon knew immediately what he wanted, so she moved closer to him. Then the man grabbed her arm so tightly that she couldn't even move it. He pulled her down afterward, and the girl had to sit down beside him in the hay. Gwyn looked at her carefully for a while, and she at him. He then moved closer to her and embraced her, even dipping his head into her shoulder. At that moment, Gwyn thought of the fact that this girl reminded him of a strong kind of alcohol. The more of it he drank, the more he still wanted it. She's like a heady drink you don't want to give up, and at the moment, the man certainly didn't want to let her go from this embrace. He continued to hold her for a while. After that, he greedily started kissing her neck and pulling off her work clothes. When the girl saw this, she was very surprised, and he laid her down on the hay to make it much more comfortable and piled his whole weight on top of her. For a while Dawn just stared at him, her face once again expressionless. No emotion, as if she didn't care. Then Gwyn asked in a quiet voice that if she didn't like it, she could just say, "Try to at least get angry just once." But the girl again said nothing. Then he concluded that if she was silent, she was satisfied with everything, and perhaps even liked it. He touched his hand to her waist, and wondered if she wanted some sort of continuation. But the girl again did not surrender a single sound, her face showing no emotion. It annoyed the man very much, for he could not understand anything in this way. However, what annoyed Gwyn the most was that he tries to keep his distance, and she just stays silent. He decides to make a move to get closer, but she continues to remain silent. The man suggested that it must have been a habit she had developed when she was still a helpless slave. No matter who is in front of you, it is best to keep silent in order to protect your body and your life. It was her way of protecting herself all the time. She tries to protect her heart by any means necessary so that no one can hurt her, which means her heart will be closed to Gwyn for now, and she will not trust him in any way. So at that moment, the man took off his cloak and covered the girl with it, asking her if she played chess. Dawn was very surprised by this action, for she was already prepared for the worst consequences. However, everything was bypassed. He still continued to stand over her, and the girl replied that she could play chess quite a bit. Then Gwyn asked if she wanted to play it after dinner. He smiled and also added that if she suddenly won, he would listen to her wishes and would definitely try to fulfill them. And then he asked if she would agree to such conditions. Dawn, hearing this, was very surprised and wondered what her wishes were even about. Gwyn said, for example, it could be complete freedom of her actions. The girl continued to keep a calm expression on her face and said she didn't want freedom. When he heard this, he was very surprised. But moving closer, he asked how it was possible that she didn't need any freedom. The girl explained in a calm voice that any slave dies a slave anyway, and it was better for her to stay in this place, however, to guarantee her safety. When Gwyn heard this, he was surprised, unable to believe that she actually preferred safety over freedom. When he got off her and Dawn was able to sit on the hay, he looked at her and realized that it was basically logical and even wise of her to do so. It's true. It's better to serve a lord who treats you well than to go into the open world where you might just get squashed like a bug. Besides, she understands very well what attracts men. He thinks that perhaps that is why she is constantly trying to keep an unemotional appearance, in order to avoid hurting herself with her own beauty. But he suddenly wondered when exactly she had given up her emotions, and how long it had been going on. At that moment, Gwyn moved closer to her and kissed her forehead. After that, they were silent for a while. The girl was a little uneasy, but she still inquired of the gentleman what he himself desired. The man heard this and immediately thought about it. He tried to find the right words so as not to frighten her away, and after much deliberation, Gwyn said he wanted to be able to kiss her at any moment, and then laughed. He put his hand to her face, fixing her hair, and said that absolutely. But he could do it now whenever he wanted, but then he'd lose at their game. She abruptly removed his hand from her face and said that she agreed after all. Gwyn was a little surprised that she'd acted so abruptly and that she'd agreed so quickly, but he was glad anyway. And the girl also said that when he wasn't going to take the opportunity, she wished he wouldn't touch her at all. The man smiled and asked if she didn't like him enough to be disgusted by it. Dawn wasn't going to hide her emotions, so she said that everything was completely true. It surprised him a little, but he said that he actually liked her a lot. But still he agreed to the proposal and said that this evening they would play chess and see what would fulfill the wish. Soon evening finally came, and they played their first game. Gwyn won, of course. He was very pleased with himself. Then he started writing some vulgarities, as his desire, but the girl noticed it in time, and said that he was writing the wrong word. Gwyn realized that wouldn't go over well with her, so he immediately crossed out that word, and wrote there about a free kiss. She was already satisfied, because that was the condition they'd agreed on. Then he handed her a piece of paper and asked her to sign it. In fact, at that moment he was surprised that she could see his mistake clearly, for the ability to read and write was the privilege of aristocrats, and not even all of them. He did not know since when the slave had learned to read and even to write correctly, but he realized that if they found out about it, she could even be punished. Dayon, in turn, began to sign the paper because everything was honest. He sighed heavily and realized that she had corrected him anyway. It was a serious offense to show him that she was literate, and he didn't know if she had enjoyed the game so much that she had forgotten her manners. Gwyn watched the woman intently, and then thought about the fact that she was the kind of woman who unknowingly attracted men without even realizing how much they might like her. So he took the piece of paper and walked closer to her, saying that since it was a matter of course, he would use the authorization he had gotten right away. He reached across the table and began to crawl closer to his slave, and then their lips came in contact in a fervent and passionate kiss. Soon after that, they played no more. Gwyn took his evening shower as usual, and then suddenly an assistant knocked on his door and told him some very important but shocking news. When the man heard this, he asked in surprise how she could have disappeared. The maid said that she had said she would make soup, left to make it, and then simply did not return. The older maid decided to stop by to check on her and see if she was okay. Then Gwyn immediately realized she wasn't there when the girl entered. The woman said it was just like that. She waited for a long time, but the slave never came back. Gwyn looked at his watch at that moment and saw that it was 10 o'clock in the evening. He didn't understand if she had done that because of the game they'd played. But then he thought about it and realized that not at all, because she wasn't stupid enough to run away just because of some ridiculous kiss. Well, then Gwyn was left with one question. Why did she do it after all? The maid bowed and, apologizing, said that sometimes she had already gone somewhere at this late hour. The man looked at her in surprise and asked for more details. The girl said that about once every 3 or 4 days, she left the castle right in the middle of the night, when everyone had already gone to bed. The servant said that she was secretly meeting with the count, but there was also a rumor that she was a spy for another lord and reported at night all the information she learned. Gwyn looked at her in surprise when he heard this, and also wondered who could have said such a thing about her in the first place. The girl replied in a trembling voice that she unfortunately didn't know this, but when this maid comes back, all her clothes are wet, her hair is disheveled, and her face is completely red, which is why many people thought that she had intimate encounters with someone in the forest. In fact then, when the girl lost in chess, then she absolutely refused to kiss this man and kept her mouth closed. Gwyn got angry when she wasn't going to honor her terms of the agreement, so he dwelled her on the table and moved closer, asking her to open her mouth. The girl just lay and looked at him, and he tried to open her lips with his hands, but nothing worked. Then the man said that she is not a child, and does not understand why she behaves like that. Then he suddenly moved closer to her, and asked her if perhaps she would rather make love than kiss each other. Dayon remained silent for a while longer, but then said that in that case the kiss would last from the time he touched her lips, until their lips were no longer touching, and it would only be once. Gwyn heard this and smiled and said that he agreed to such a condition, and after that they started kissing each other. The girl at this moment felt just disgusted. She was overwhelmed with bad emotions. She even clenched her fist because of her anger. But at this moment she suddenly felt his hands going lower. Dawn immediately turned away from him and said they had only agreed on a kiss, so she started to push his hands away from her skirt. Gwyn was actually pleased, and even that, because this day he was able to go a little farther than all the previous ones. After this kiss, the girl angrily left and closed the door behind her and went to her room. The man, on the other hand, remained sitting there. For a while he just smiled. After that he poured himself some more wine to relax. He thought about the fact that as long as she didn't lose, the girl would always be very careful. He started to drink the wine and realized that basically he didn't really want to lose himself, so he would also proceed with caution. The next day, when they dueled again, Gwyn kept thinking about the information he had gotten the previous day from the maid. They were playing chess, and he found it hard enough to believe that she had any man. But it was entirely possible given her beauty. They continued to play chess. At that moment, Gwyn imagined some man hugging her and flirting with her. And it was because of these thoughts that he couldn't concentrate properly on the game. So Dayon soon said that she had beaten him. He wasn't too upset, for he realized it had to happen at some point. So he asked that she speak her wish. The girl pondered for a while and then asked that he make a law where all garbage would be thrown away in one place. Gwyn, hearing this, was very surprised. He knew, of course, that she wouldn't ask for some jewelry or something, but this wish was even more unexpected. He didn't understand why she was even asking for some sort of garbage disposal law when she could have such a variety of desires. In fact, in densely populated cities, women give birth to babies surrounded by garbage, and these babies then play with it and even eat it sometimes. Daeon explained that the men who are tired after work even sleep in all this garbage. It's like a home for them. When Gwyn heard this, he wondered, does she really want to make this law for the commoners? But the girl explained that the commoners were the very image of the Lord. He smiled and said that was an interesting enough opinion that he had never heard it before. Well, Gwyn himself realized at that moment that this idea was like a foreign idea to them, and it was rather peculiar to some foreigners. He watched the girl carefully and realized that basically her ideas were absolutely different from theirs. Science and education have a very strong influence on one's surroundings, any way you look at it. But a man who lives his whole life as a slave would certainly not think so. So, Gwyn is very curious as to who has been able to influence her so much when he thinks about the fact that it might just be the mysterious man she meets in the woods at night. He sighed heavily and overcame his emotions of anger, then wondered, does she really want to create this law for such a purpose? She explained that trash accumulates every summer, and it is the root cause of many of the illnesses that occur afterward. However, Gwyn said that few people actually think that way. Daeon insisted and said that she actually thought so. He was silent for a while. And then, with a heavy sigh, he said that such a thing was very difficult to follow, and no one would immediately follow this law. People might even start rioting. The girl in turn said that one should just not dump dead cattle in the river, which is used by many people. Also, anything that rots should be left in one's home and not immediately thrown out into the street. However, Gwyn asked that with that, if she wants to introduce such laws, then an argument needs to be made as to why people will end up benefiting from it, because otherwise they definitely won't follow the law. Daeon pondered for a while, then said that many people die of these diseases in the summer, but more people die of starvation in winter, so they need to reduce the number of deaths at least in summer. So they will have more labor, and there will be many more farmers, which means more crops. But Gwyn took umbrage and said that commoners don't even understand what's trash and what isn't, and asked how she was even going to explain to them what should be thrown away and what should be kept. The girl turned to the side and pulled grape stumps out of the box, saying that if this could still be used, it was definitely not trash. She brushed that aside and they were silent for a while. Gwyn, hearing her idea, thought of that answer, but it was clear enough, clear enough. He was actually also surprised that a girl with a completely calm expression was able to argue with him and defend her point of view. But it didn't just surprise him. It also annoyed him. The fact that she just couldn't keep her mouth shut sometimes. Seeing his pensive face, the girl wondered, can he do it? When Gwyn heard those words, he was very surprised and angry at the same time. He didn't understand how she could ever doubt his abilities. When they first made their argument, he said he would be sure to listen to her wishes and try to fulfill them. That was basically his promise. And now she was asking him to make a new law for the commoners. Of course, it was hard enough and responsible enough, but he ruled this country now. Gwyn thought about it and realized that she was immediately planning to use their game to her advantage, so it even amused him. Of course, after all that was going on, the master told his servants to start carrying out this order. So one day, Rob, passing by Jafar, inquired, "How's the trash situation over there?" The man asked the man what was even going on, and also asked him to explain everything to him in more detail. Rob said that they are still busy building the road, and he doesn't understand how the gentleman wants them to start doing something else in parallel, something big enough. Besides, Jafar sighed heavily and looked at the paper and said that they had already allocated a warehouse for it, and everything needed would arrive tomorrow. So it had already begun its actions. In fact, the work really did find all over the place. Work was actively underway in the county in order to get the roads built. Rob sighed heavily after looking at all this, and said that they were almost out of hands as it was. And he didn't know what the gentleman was thinking at all. Jafar was also incredibly angry and said in a quiet voice that he wanted to pass a law to collect garbage in one place. And if they suddenly want change in the commoners' society, they themselves need to set an example for them. That's why the master wants them to start with themselves first. Rob turned away from him and said he didn't understand anything at all, then sighed heavily and said the gentleman was in his repertoire as always. Jafar didn't answer anything to that. He thought about the fact that they had just recently finished with the census, and now they still had more land to distribute to families with more labor. For small families, all land of the appropriate size would be given away. Previously, in fact, all land was owned only by the Lord. Of course, he was the one who got most of the harvest, and the smaller portion was distributed to all the other citizens. However, now the land would belong to the farmers. It was decided that a certain portion of the farmers' crops would be paid to the Lord as taxes. The war is not over yet, so there are quite a lot of bandits in the territory. That's why it was a bold decision to give land to farmers. Jafar was well aware that he was not alone in thinking that this was too bold a reform, especially at the beginning of their reign. Rob, after a while of silence, struck his fist on the weave and said that he had thought that the Lord had come only for the purpose of conquering lands. But now he wasn't so sure. He didn't understand why they would spend money on a small region like Orang and introduce some progressive reforms here. In fact, the farmers dread an invasion from the outside every year. For in the event, the king will not have time to do anything to settle internal conflicts among the aristocrats. The master had always understood these circumstances, and so had always acted very carefully. But now Jafar was no longer sure of the correctness of his actions. Rob, after a little thought, said it could be a case of this woman he met here. Jafar asked in surprise, "What woman is he even talking about?" But the man got angry and asked him not to make a fool of himself, for he knew perfectly well who he was talking about. Then the guy, without taking his eyes off the papers, said that no one knows for sure what's in the gentleman's head. Rob replied that the woman was actually a lioness. He said that she appears to be a weak and fragile bird, yet she actually has the spirit of a lioness in her heart. He turned to Jafar and inquired if he even knew that lionesses were very good at hunting their prey, and almost never missed. The boy didn't say anything to him, but turned and asked what their people were saying about it. Rob replied that no one had said much about it yet. One Crown is clearly interested in this woman. After all, when Daon ran away, the one who first found her in the forest was this man. He is certainly loyal and trustworthy as a knight. However, still, no one can be completely trusted. Jafar thought at this moment that indeed, when a girl gets into a man's mind, things can change very drastically, even in the most faithful. Rob turned away and replied that every time she walked past him, he always lowered his gaze and even started to almost tremble. But in fact, upon reflection, the man said that this doesn't even happen only to him. Everyone lowers their gaze because of her special charm. Jafar wondered, does he really think it's going to be okay? His friend said that a knight is someone who can control himself, so they should definitely not worry about it. They were silent for a while, but then Rob suddenly turned to the guy and asked, maybe he should kill that girl and be done with it. Jafar was shocked when he heard this sentence, but the guy kept talking and said that if he thought this woman would harm their master, he should just say one word to him. Rob was going to blow her head off immediately, without slowing down, if it could really interfere with their master's ability to make good decisions. He looked gravely at Jafar and repeated the question, should she be killed? The man looked away from him and answered nothing. At that moment, Rob suddenly started laughing very loudly and couldn't stop. When the boy saw this, he looked at him in surprise and asked him why he was laughing so hard all of a sudden. And he in turn replied that he had not thought their ever-so-calm Jafar would be so tense upon hearing this request. The man didn't like that, so he turned away, and the man summarized by saying that this girl was clearly not an ordinary woman. Jafar agreed with him and said that she was indeed not an ordinary woman. Shortly thereafter, the man returned to the gentleman's office to hand him some papers. But as soon as he entered, he saw some small notes on his desk. Moving closer, Jafar considered and wondered, is this really a kissing license? Gwyn glimpsed in his direction to see what he was talking about, then turned back to the papers and said that was right. There weren't many, but what you got is what you got. He was even happy with that. He explained that he was saving them in order to explore everything at once. Jafar, when he heard this, said he was more like a squirrel picking acorns in the park. Gwyn sighed indignantly, however, and said she didn't like that analogy. and he didn't look like such a squirrel at all. However, his assistant insisted and said that she was just perfect for the situation. The master immediately laughed when he heard this. The tension in the conversation went away, and they were fine again. He handed him some of the papers and asked Jafar if he would be busy this evening. The boy replied that no, he was completely free. Then Gwyn said that since he was free, she would go with him. The man had no say, so he took the papers from him and said he would do as he wished. As Jafar turned around, he thought about how he had heard that Dawn leaves the castle at night, and even when the Lord is playing with the women, he is still very lonely. After all, he was never interested in the personal life that women could have, so he could never even think that there would be such a girl who could catch his eye and interest his soul. Soon, when he had sorted out the papers, he came closer to the gentleman and inquired if he thought that if he collected 10 of these kissing authorizations, she would grant him special favors. Gwyn immediately smiled and said he hadn't even thought of that. But the guy had given him a very good idea. He immediately got in the mood, he saw, thinking of all the different vulgarities he could ask for. Well, it was soon nightfall, and the two of them set out on such an investigative mission. Jafar, who was incredibly tired, sat next to his lord and straight up prayed that the girl would not leave the castle that day. Gwyn, for his part, looked around very carefully and listened. Suddenly he heard footsteps. Jafar also noticed it, and they both looked in a direction. The master thought to himself as he heard a very familiar sound of footsteps. In fact, it was indeed a girl who, in the middle of the night, dressed in special clothes, went somewhere on her own. Immediately he turned around and ran over to the other side, in order to be closer to her. However, when Jafar did the same, he accidentally hit a branch with his foot. Dawn, in complete silence of course, heard it, and so she immediately turned around to look for the source of the noise. But the boy, not in turn, had already managed to run up and hid in the bushes with his master. When the girl turned away and went on her way, Gwyn turned to him indignantly and said that he was sitting too much on paperwork, and it was just a shame, for the military had almost been noticed by a common woman because of his inattention. Jafar was indignant and said that the military was not taught to watch out for women in their service. So it was certainly not his fault. In fact, the guy was very annoyed by the whole situation. Soon afterward, however, they went on their way. The men followed the girl's footsteps, and soon they came to a very interesting and unusual place. Then Gwyn suddenly stopped, and smiling eagerly, said that she was a very odd woman. Jafar immediately came up behind him, and he wanted to see what the gentleman was staring at like that. In fact, the two of them were looking at Dawn, who walked over to the water and began to undress, getting farther and farther in. When Gwyn saw her begin to remove her shirt and show her naked body, he immediately turned to the aide and told her in a stern voice not to look. Jafar turned around abruptly. In fact, the boy didn't really want to look at this spectacle, so he stepped back even to the side. The girl, in turn, slowly began to wade into the cool water, which was incredibly clear. Gwyn wasn't about to leave, so he stayed not far away from her in the bushes and began to watch this girl carefully, who attracted him more and more every minute. When Dawn walked into the middle of the river, she began to run her hands over the water and hum some kind of melody. After that, she even began to sing the words. When Gwyn heard it, he realized that this song was probably from another country, most likely even her homeland. The man thought about it, and as he continued to watch her peaceful movements, he realized that she was in a very good mood, the way she was humming that song. When he turned in her direction again, he was very surprised. In fact, he had never seen her smile before, but now, as the girl stood in the water and flicked her hair, humming a tune, she was joyful. Her beautiful, perfect body was enveloped in moonlight, in which she looked even more beautiful. Gwyn clenched his fist to contain his emotions and just watched her quietly from the bushes. He lifted his head up. After a while, looking at the stars and listening to her melody, he noticed that the constellation Capricorn was already visible in the starry sky. This meant that it would get colder very soon. Jafar, for his part, sat not far from the Lord, turned away from the girl, and still couldn't understand what was even going on. Gwyn suddenly smiled and, with a heavy sigh, said in a whisper that he could catch a cold. The assistant looked at him in surprise but did not say a word. In fact, the guy had a very bad feeling about it. He knew that Dawn was like a poisonous flower. She's beautiful and attractive, and she kills men with her beauty. At that moment, he was reminded of Rube's words, who had suggested killing the woman, but he quickly pushed those thoughts away from him, for he knew it was wrong. When the evening of the next day came, the boy and the girl again met in a chess match, as they had contractually agreed. Gwyn winced again, so he handed her a piece of paper for her to sign, and also wondered if people had started throwing out trash by the rules like she wanted them to. The girl was a little unexpecting of such a question, but said coldly and unemotionally that they were now operating by the rules. Gwyn smiled at this point and thought about what he actually understood. Because it is a good feeling when your law begins to be enforced. You feel a sense of drive and even pleasure. But he thought about politics at that moment, knowing that one change would need to be followed by another. So the girl would now try her best to beat him at chess in order to realize her perfect plan. Gwyn was well aware that over the years she had probably accumulated a lot of rules and problems that she wanted to change. When the girl signed the contract, Gwyn wondered if she was still bored, since he was winning all the time. He showed her his 3 kissing coupons and looked at her with a smile and suggested that she was already having a little fun. Dawn looked at him in surprise and wondered what he was even talking about. She really didn't understand. Then the man explained in a calm voice that he always takes a bath at the same time. It should be ready by 10 o'clock in the evening, so they start heating the water half an hour before. As long as he didn't go into the bathroom, she would be there for the entire half hour. Dawn listened carefully to his terms and was very surprised. The girl inquired what she had to do it for, but Gwyn only replied that it was just a little game. In fact, he really wasn't going to break his promise to touch her body, because that would be wrong of him. So Gwyn replied that he would love for her to join him and thoroughly wash every corner of her body. He wants the water that will be in the tub to take on her scent. He wants to know what her body tastes like. He held out some papers in front of him, showing them as evidence, and then putting them aside, said that if she was against it, surely they could find an alternative. However, Dawn immediately interrupted him half-heartedly and said that she agreed to those terms. Gwyn smiled. He was very pleased with himself, then put some papers on the table and said that in that case they would meet again this evening. From that moment some number of hours passed, and the girl complied with his conditions. In fact, from that day on, he kept ordering her to take a bath in front of him. In this bath the girl could relax, and little by little the weight on her shoulders finally lightened. Well, Gwyn himself is actually the only one in this world who can embody such a life for an ordinary slave. He also hoped that she would be at least a little grateful to him for that. And he even began to think that he was beginning to understand her. At least, he feels like he's starting to. But then suddenly one of the knights came running into his room, turning to the Lord and saying that Dawn was suddenly missing. In fact, Gwyn wasn't really angry or surprised when he heard this information. He took into account the fact that she was always misunderstood and that there were always reasons for everything she did. However, this time it wasn't like usual. She didn't even come back after midnight. Soon Jafar came in to see him, and seeing the gentleman's face immediately said that it was not his fault. However, Gwyn continued to stare at him angrily and didn't say a single word. The boy was very surprised and asked if he really thought it was all because of him. He didn't say anything to that either. He was silent for a while, just pacing the room, and then he said that something must have happened since she'd done it. In fact, they had even already organized search parties that were actively looking for the girl throughout the forest. Gwyn told the deputy to find her as soon as possible, but the boy was indignant and said that she could have just run away, and he didn't see what the fuss was about. However, the gentleman said with complete certainty in a quiet voice that she could not have done that. Jafar insisted and asked why he was so sure. The guy really didn't understand why he didn't question his decision. After all, she was originally a woman who couldn't be trusted. The Lord turned away from him towards the window and began to clench his hands hard because of anger, and Jafar in turn wondered if he really trusted her. Gwyn was silent for a while, then said that the girl knows perfectly well that she benefits greatly from being near him. So she certainly wouldn't run away, because there's simply no reason to do so. Jafar, hearing this, was very much surprised and asked what he meant by advantageous. Then he summed up by saying that the gentleman had already become completely obsessed with this woman. He said he couldn't understand why he let the slave choose what was favorable to her and what was not. Gwyn was silent for a while. He only glared angrily at the boy and said nothing. Jafar finally calmed down after a while, and in a quiet voice, stretching out each word, he said that Dawn was really attractive. Besides, she was also a foreigner. The master wondered why he was saying that. The aide explained that if the gentleman bones her eye into his heart, he will simply lose. So he asks that he think of himself first and not other people. Well, Gwyn suddenly couldn't stand it and started yelling at him, asking what's the use of this? What good would it do, since he'd been acting like this all along and had accomplished almost nothing? He thought for a while and then said that if God asked him to choose between his country and a woman, he would not hesitate to choose a woman, of course. When Jafar heard this, he started shouting at the Lord, not understanding how he could speak these words. However, the latter looked at him in surprise and asked him if he doubted his decisions. Gwyn asked if he remembered appointing him as his assistant when he was just a regular whipping boy, and made an ordinary hunter into a true knight who can defend an entire empire. He looked at Jafar, who lowered his head, and asked if he still despised that slave girl, and wondered what was the difference between Dawn and him at all. The assistant was silent for a while. Then, clenching his hand into a fist, he said that they were completely different. The master looked at him in surprise and asked, "What is the difference? Is it only because she is a woman?" Jafar couldn't stand it. He started shouting and said that if he left her by his side it would definitely lead to his downfall. It never ended well. Gwyn started yelling loudly too and said that if he didn't like his decision he could leave right now. He wouldn't object. Jafar, on hearing this, was very much surprised. For some time he stood at the gentleman, who had already turned away and was looking out of the window. Then the guy, who was incredibly angry, took his jacket and was about to leave, but then he suddenly stopped. They stood in silence for a while, and then Jafar sighed heavily and asked, "Has the gentleman really fallen in love with her?" Gwyn was silent for a while. Well, then he sighed heavily too. He said he didn't understand it yet. It would have to be checked yet. But then suddenly he smiled and turned and looked at the aide and said that the more he told him to leave her, the more he was drawn straight to this girl like a magnet. Jafar waved his head and said he didn't think she would open up to him fully sooner or later. Gwyn fixed his hair and said he didn't care about that. The most important thing was that she would eventually belong to him. He looked outside and said that if she suddenly fell into the wrong hands, he would immediately strangle her with his bare hands. However, at this moment, a knight suddenly ran into them, opening the door abruptly and started shouting, saying that they had found the girl after all. Gwyn immediately threw his cloak over himself and followed the knight out, asking, "Was she really in the cattle yard?" The latter immediately confirmed this information. As he approached this hut, he couldn't believe that the girl had been on the castle grounds all this time, and they were actively searching for her like this. Gwyn walked closer, and when he opened the door he saw that the girl was indeed lying on the hay, curled up in a ball and covered by something. He felt a sense of relief when he found out that she hadn't run off anywhere. But then worry came over him because he thought she might be very ill. For Dawn was lying all alone in this cold. Her body was shaking and she was unconscious. After these feelings came anger immediately to him, and all of them together tore straight from the inside of his heart. He didn't know what was happening to him, but they were very strong. At this moment, Gwyn suddenly turned abruptly to the knights and told them to tell everyone right now. He appreciated everyone's hard work, so tomorrow they would have meat and alcohol waiting for them. He continued to speak loudly for everyone to hear and said that tomorrow they could have a good rest. The people who were involved in the search for the girl immediately got excited and started shouting some cheerful words. Gwyn thought at this point that perhaps they didn't deserve such a great reward for finding just a slave girl. Yet they had been running around all night looking for this very slave under terrible weather. Their fatigue would eventually turn into anger, which would be directed at the girl who had even been on the castle grounds all this time. At that moment, a knight came up to Gwyn, who was just about to tell him where the girl was, and asked that he not let anyone get close. He also asked to bring a thick blanket and a heated stone to be wrapped in cloth. Gwyn then moved closer to the girl and touched her cold, wet body. He noticed that she was burning up, realized that she had a fever, and Dawn was sweating. He took a closer look at her face and saw a concerned expression and noticed her breathing was intermittent. He realized that she had huddled away from everyone and lay in such a quiet place because the girl just didn't trust anyone, and in such a terrible state, she didn't come to ask for help. He took the girl into his arms and asked in a quiet voice if she thought she was over the moon. Pulling her weakened body closer to him, he realized that she wasn't even awake, much less aware of what was happening. In fact, for the first time he saw something human in the girl. Before, she reminded him of an ordinary doll, cold and perfect. Daon, hearing him talk, was even able to open her eyes for a while. But then she was too weakened and quickly fell asleep again. Soon a knight came to them, bringing a blanket and a heated stone. Gwyn immediately took the stone and put it on her belly to warm it. Then he took a warm blanket and wrapped the girl with it, and pressed her close to him, so that he could also warm her with his body. It was deep night outside, and they were still sitting there. The people had already gone home, rejoicing at the Lord's new rule that allowed them a day off. Gwyn snuggled closer to the girl, and little by little began to fall asleep too, for he was tired for the day, and she didn't even wake up. The girl was lying on his chest, but at least she had stopped shaking. He thought he could talk to her, and told her that he had lost his father when he was only 12 years old, and at a young age he had been given the title of Lord because of it. Daon, when she heard his voice, woke up a little and began to listen to his story. But she did not answer anything, for she was still too weak. Since he was just a child, he easily squandered his position, land, and power at that time. He had to learn to survive in this harsh world. Every human being wants to survive. However, even for such a simple thing, something that is given from birth, you have to fight. However, Gwyn said that's why he thinks it's unfair that people have to survive in different environments, with different rights. Some have more privileges, some less. Then suddenly Dawn opened her eyes and said in a quiet voice that slaves have no rights. When the man heard this, he immediately smiled. He realized that he had managed to get her interested in his conversation, and guessed that she was getting better now that she was getting into the argument. Gwyn said that he is a lord who has a lot of rights. However, that doesn't mean he is happy with the current situation. He continues to fight in order to get more out of this life. He looked her straight in the eye and told her that she didn't need to fight at all, absolutely, because she just had to win her rights against him. And that was it. And in that case, she would only have to fight him, and that would be it. When he saw her surprised face, he asked, "Doesn't she want to do it?" He asked that when she felt bad, she'd just talk about it, and when she didn't like something, she would talk about it too. He became very serious and said that you don't have to lie at all to earn your freedom. Gwyn suddenly smiled and said that she would have to try very hard in order to win it in the end. Well, when he realized that the girl didn't appreciate his joke, it said that he would definitely change her. She would become a complete person who would laugh, cry, get angry, and show selfishness. Dawn was silent for a while and just stared at the man. But then she gave her gaze away and said in a quiet voice that she hated him. The man wasn't the least bit surprised by this. He suddenly laughed and said he knew it perfectly well. That's why he's ready to see her face in anger faster than her smile. She pressed back against him and began to shake again because of the cold. He asked, "Is she still in pain?" The girl replied that it had been like 2 days already. Then he yawned and suggested that she should go to bed already. She must be very tired after all, but Dawn just sat there looking at him for a while. Then the girl suddenly reached out with her hands and moved closer to him. Then she ran her fingers along his chin, wiping away the drops. Gwyn was sitting with a completely calm expression at this time, but then suddenly, the girl immediately recoiled when he opened his eyes. He suddenly saw something wet on her face and asked, "Is that a raindrop too?" The girl averted her gaze and said that that was right. In fact, she was very worried and embarrassed about the situation. After a long silence, Gwyn moved closer to her and said he really wanted her both body and mind. She might think she'd stolen his heart completely. That was why he cared for the girl so much. At the end, he called her his slave, and when Dawn heard those words, she lowered her head. The man kept talking. He looked at her carefully and said that he could certainly get her by brute force. However, he wanted her to begin to desire him. The girl turned away abruptly and said that there was no way she was going to sleep with a man she didn't love. He sighed, and turning her face toward his, said that in that case, he would make her fall in love with him. Some time passed from that moment, and when they sat down again in the evening for the duel, the man suddenly held out to her a number of different pieces of paper. He put them on the table and said there were as many as 12 of them already. Daon knew exactly what that meant, and what he wanted, so she lowered her gaze. The man sat across from her and said that he had actually planned to collect more, but he couldn't take it anymore. He pointed again to his papers and said that with this much he could enjoy her for quite a while. Gwyn pointed to the empty seat next to him and told her to come over to him, and added that if she suddenly minded, she could leave quietly. But the girl silently rose from her seat and sat down beside Gwyn without saying a word. He reached out and was about to touch her shoulder, but he felt her shiver and looked at the girl in surprise. But she said she was fine. But he could see that she was nervous. But it still didn't mean he was going to hold back for her. So the man wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her close to him. Daon resisted for a while longer. She tried to deflect as far as she could, but he had his arms around her in such a way that she couldn't do anything. Gwyn watched the girl intently for a while. After that he moved closer and said, if he remembered correctly, that the most important thing was to keep his lips on hers. Daon didn't say anything back to him, and he said, smiling, that he thought she understood that every kiss was going to be a very long one. Then he moved closer to her and started kissing her passionately on the lips. It lasted until the evening. It was already dark outside, but they kept kissing, and after a while, he suddenly finished and moved up to her ear, beginning to gently caress the girl there with his lips. She suddenly trembled. Daon immediately pulled him away from her and told him that they had a pact that it would only be kissing. Gwyn smiled, however, and said that she hadn't told him that he could only kiss on the lips after all, so it didn't violate their contract. Of course, the girl couldn't say anything against him, because that was really what it was. Gwyn, in turn, continued kissing her and moved his lips down to her neck. Daon was very pleased by this, so she even made some kind of incomprehensible sound when he heard her voice, one that was very much to his liking. The man looked at her red and embarrassed face, and then he started kissing her lips again. He noticed that Daon was trying to be serious even at times like this, for he saw the girl curl her fingers and count the kisses carefully. Gwyn in turn reached for her shirt and began to unbutton it slowly. Daon, seeing this, immediately became very serious. When the man reached up to kiss her again, she suddenly covered her breasts with her hand. When Gwyn saw this, he was outraged. The man said he had accepted her terms, so he thought he was being fair. He was silent for a while, then smiled playfully and asked if she minded if they continued. Daon was very tense, but realized she had to stick to the agreement, so the girl agreed, but warned him that there should only be kissing, and nothing more. The man smiled and said that of course he wouldn't break their rules. Then he suddenly grabbed her hand and moved his lips lower, straight down to her belly. He kissed Daon slowly, making sure to please her, and when Gwyn heard excited breathing and sobs, he knew his plan was working. The man reached his hand to her legs, lifting her skirt up, but Daon abruptly began to stop his hand. Gwyn smiled and said she needn't worry, for he wasn't going to go too far. Daon looked at him fearfully, but said nothing. The man thought about the fact that she was usually cool-headed, but now it was obvious that she was very nervous. He actually thought she would be calmer during this, but as he paid attention to her hands, which continued to curl their fingers as they counted the kisses, he noticed they were trembling. He realized that was all he could do for the day. He didn't want her to hate him anymore. When she makes that pitiful face, he feels sorry for her. The man suddenly moved closer to her and slowly ran his finger over her palm. Then he kissed her quickly on the forehead and moved away. The girl, sensing this, was very surprised and looked at him, not understanding what had happened. Gwyn wasn't really a big fan of short kisses, but right now, however, it was much needed. He walked over to a nearby table and picked up a towel. The man then turned back to her and began to slowly run his hand over the places where he had just recently kissed her. He sighed heavily and said that what he wanted most right now was to burrow into her. Then the man continued kissing her and slowly ran his tongue down her legs. The girl was suddenly overwhelmed with emotion, and she threw her head up, exhaling very loudly. Gwyn, when he heard this, immediately looked at her. The girl immediately covered her mouth with her hands and blushed all over. but he only smiled smugly. At this point, he suddenly stopped and just stood there for a while, looking at how uncomfortable she was. But after that, he started hovering over Dawn again, and they held a long eye contact. And then he started kissing her passionately on the lips again. It was very fast, but at the same time quite long. Suddenly, however, someone interrupted them. Some man dressed all in uniform came into the room and said it was just unbelievable. The girl immediately moved away from Gwyn when she heard someone else's voice, and he in turn threw a towel over her to cover her. When the man looked to the side, he saw several people who had entered the room. The stranger apologized and said that he had knocked quite a lot, but nobody answered him. Gwyn was silent for a while. Then he looked angrily at the man and saluted Prince Zack. He didn't turn around or even look at the girl. He told Zack that he was very busy, so he asked him to leave. Taking his turn, came closer, and said that means playing with women is the norm for him. However, welcoming guests who had traveled such a long way was not. The man looked at him indignantly and wondered what he himself thought at all. But Scent, for his part, raised his hat and turned, starting to leave the room. By the time the boy and girl were alone, Dawn had already managed to tuck her sweatshirt back in and stood up to leave. But Gwyn suddenly intercepted her hand and stopped her. Then he put some tickets in her hand, which he counted out from the big pile. The girl was surprised at this behavior, but when she counted, she saw that she had 4 tickets left in her hands. That meant that he had a lot more kisses ahead of him that he could do. The next morning, Gwyn arrived with Zack at the small campground that was nearby, and Zack turned to the man and asked if he really planned to create a full-fledged state in this place, since he'd even started on the roads already. Gwyn didn't show much interest and said that there were absolutely no resources on that land, so there was no point in establishing a state in that place. Zack agreed with him and said that was a very good point, and he said it had already been a good year for them, so the man could stop at that for now and not ruin his father's legacy. Gwyn looked at him in surprise and wondered if the boy wanted to ask him to marry him. He didn't understand what kind of proposal that was. Zack immediately got worried and asked what kind of nonsense he was even talking about. Of course, he didn't mean it at all. Guy explained that he drew this conclusion because the latter was trying to control his expenses, despite the fact that he was not his wife. Zack said he had heard that it was customary in distant countries to build roads for even the smallest settlements, though it was more customary for people to trample their own roads into such small places. Zack asked why the time and money was being spent on this stone road construction, because it was for the commoners who could safely do without it. He asked if he wasn't curious. Za, in turn, asked if he had occupied the orang for curiosity's sake. Gwyn sat down on the couch and said not at all. He occupied the place because he had heard that Dalberry was a slave of unfailing beauty, and he, as an inveterate womanizer, couldn't just walk by like that. The man stood up and walked over to the gun rack, then took one and stuck it in the table. Zack was a little unaware of this action, but he sighed heavily and told the guy that he was a very big selfish guy after all. Gwyn smiled and said that was actually where his power lay. Soon after that, they talked a little more, and then they heard loud rumblings. It was the man who had promised the people. When the man came out of the tent, he looked into the distance and said that everyone was ready to hunt. Zack came out behind him and said that the king would be confused when he found out he was occupying Orang, just as he himself was shocked. He came close to him and wondered what he was thinking about. Gwyn sent one of the workers over to him at that moment, and said that if he was told to leave the place, he would. But he's still going to take this woman with him. There's no way he's leaving her alone in this place. Zack was a little surprised. He didn't immediately realize which woman he was talking about. But when he guessed, he asked in surprise, "Does he really want to take that Dalberry slave girl?" Gwyn replied that she was his now. When the man heard, he was surprised and wondered, is the boy really going to leave Orang? In fact, without a master, this small territory seems to be consumed by the flames of war in less than even a year. If that's the case, then it's much more advantageous to leave him here so that he can rule in this place. That was exactly what Zack thought. He thought about the fact that even the king might realize this. For the only thing the king would be unsure of was the loyalty of the Exar. He looked to the side and saw girls starting to walk past him. Then Zack said, turning to his partner, that he really hoped the one who wasn't going to turn Orang into a brothel. Gwyn in turn smiled and said she hadn't even thought of that, then saluted the prince for such a wonderful idea. The man also said that when he finished his brothel, he would send him a special invitation. Zack smiled and, walking to his horse, said that he made a point of taking over the castle for the sake of just one woman. Zack got on the horse and said it was quite amusing, and he also wondered what she was like, since she managed to make him even more selfish than he was before. Zack also said he would visit tonight, and wanted to see her in person. Gwyn looked at him in surprise but said nothing. As the lord rode off with his aides, she thought that he had probably come as a warning from the other aristocrats. The man thought about his words that this time they would turn a blind eye. Next time the king would intervene personally. And besides, one day they might even order him to marry some of their beautiful princesses. Gwyn turned to his aide, who helped him onto his horse, and said that he needed to present evidence anyway. Whether Dawn was really so beautiful that he had captured Orang for her sake. He smiled and said as he left that it was about time they got the girl dressed up. Jafar was not happy with the idea, but said they would do whatever was necessary. When evening came, there were quite a few people gathered in the castle. Loud music was playing, and there were many different treats on the tables. People were dancing, mostly girls, and after a while Dawn was finally invited into the hall. When the girl entered, everyone immediately fell silent and looked only at her. The girl was wearing an incredibly gorgeous dress. She also had a piece of jewelry on her head, and she walked calmly and confidently. Zack, when he saw her, was very surprised. He couldn't even utter a single word. He didn't expect the girl to look really so beautiful. Daon in turn kept walking, and Gwyn, when he saw her in that beautiful dress, only smiled and was even more proud of her. When the girl came closer, Zack, without taking his eyes off her, told his partner that he now understood why he had been out of his mind all this time. Gwyn was a little surprised at that statement, but he started drinking alcohol himself and thought about the fact that of course it was obvious. However, after looking around at the people who were angrily staring at the girl, he didn't understand why there was such an aggressive atmosphere around. He thought that perhaps he shouldn't have dressed her up for such an evening. But then something happened that they certainly hadn't expected. Some man who was half-masked suddenly jumped up from his chair and suddenly started yelling about how it was his slave girl. The man glared angrily at the Duke and the girl, and he was on pins and needles. Then Gwyn turned to him and said that Viscount Zergok had had too much to drink. That's why he thinks he's different. And the man insisted and said that her face, there was no doubt about it, was that of a slave who had escaped from him 7 years ago. Daon in turn didn't even turn to look at him. She just stood straight and lowered her gaze.
He continued to shout across the room and said that, according to the laws of the kingdom, the laborer was the property of the owner until he was sold. He called this woman, who was standing all very nicely dressed, his slave. But the master just sat there without showing a single emotion on his face. The man said that his servant could bring the contract right then and there for them to see for themselves that she was his property. He stepped closer to the girl and with his huge hand grabbed her hair, pulling her to him. He talked about this woman belonging to him, and once this slave trader did that, then Gwyn got very angry and was not going to tolerate this kind of behavior anymore. The man looked at Daon and said that he remembered that cheeky look very well. It was maddening, and he would never forget it. And that was why the man had no doubt that this was indeed the girl. Then Gwyn asked in an angry voice, how dare he do such a thing? The man was beyond angry and questioned if he was even in his right mind and what he was hoping for by doing such a thing. He looked straight at the man and asked, could it be that he just wants to die? At this moment, the guards who were standing around all around the hall immediately grabbed their swords. Then Jafar turned to him and asked him to wait a little while, for if the Viscount was right, she did indeed belong to him. He also asked that the man not jump to conclusions until he had seen the contract itself. He then turned to the Viscount and asked him to let the girl go altogether. Gwyn continued to be angry and asked his assistant what would happen if it was all a lie, since the contract could easily be forged. The Viscount at this moment removed his mask from his face, which covered only half of it. The master looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he was doing this. But the man spoke in a low voice and asked if they could see that burn scar on his face. Then he started screaming again, pointing in Daon's direction, and said that 7 years ago she was the one who had left him. Gwyn grinned and said he understood, and then wondered if it was because the Viscount didn't know how to treat women properly that she'd run away. When he heard this, the man immediately felt uncomfortable. He remained silent for a while, not knowing what to say. However, then he remembered one small detail that was at her waist. He said she had a small mole near her navel, and he felt that with such solid proof, he certainly wouldn't need to show the contract. Gwyn immediately remembered seeing that mole near her navel and became even more wary. The Viscount turned to the principal and asked if he would let him undress her now to test the evidence. The aide, when he heard this, was very surprised and asked, "Is he really asking her to undress in front of everyone?" But the Viscount, smiling smugly, said that she was a mere laborer anyway, so he thought no one would mind undressing someone whose life was worth as much as that of cattle. Daon began to feel a little worried. However, of course she didn't show it in plain sight. Everyone was silent for a while. Then Gwyn's assistant said that she had been a slave of Dalbury, but now Prince Eskar was her master. It was his master who determined the status of an employee, and forcing this girl to undress in public would be a direct insult to Prince Eskar. So he asked that the Viscount refrain from even making such a suggestion. Gwyn was out of breath at this point and asked, "Did he really compare her life to that of cattle?" He looked straight into the Viscount's eyes and wondered, does he really think he can do whatever he wants and just get away with it? He didn't understand how the man could yell in foreign territory for an employee to be returned to him, and it irritated him immensely, the fact that he knew no boundaries. The Viscount himself was already annoyed, but because he was the lowest in status, he couldn't object to anything, and the prince said that if she really belonged to him, he wondered if he was willing to put even his own life on the line. Gwyn looked up and wondered what he would say to that. Would he be willing to fight a fair fight for this girl? At that moment, one of the guards drew his sword and threw it towards the scarred man. Of course, he realized that taking on such an unequal fight with the prince would be the sheer stupidity, so he wasn't going to do it. He stepped closer to Gwyn and asked for His Highness to support him. He asked what's the point of contracts if his property can be taken away like that. Gwyn did not listen to him, however. He rose from his seat and took the sword from the other guard, coming closer and closer to the man. But at that moment, Jarafar turned to the man and asked him to stop already, for this is too much. The Viscount is right, and he himself does not approve of this duel. Gwyn looked at him in surprise and asked, "Does he really in that case propose to just give her away?" He sighed heavily, saying that in that case it was better to just ask the very culprit of all this. And looking at Daon, he asked, "Is the Viscount really telling the truth?" The girl did not answer anything. She just stood there silent, for she knew that she could not say anything, or it would turn against her. Then the Viscount shouted and said he had further proof. This woman could not speak. He explained that in the 3 years she had spent with him, this girl had never uttered a single word. She was simply mute. Gwyn sighed heavily as he looked at her. He was well aware that this woman was using silence as a defense, and she was certainly not mute. And if Daon hadn't said a single word in all those 3 years, the situation there was incredibly dire. He wondered what this man could possibly be doing to her, since she just kept quiet throughout all this time. Then, with a heavy sigh, he turned to the Viscount again and said that in that case he was definitely mistaken. That's definitely not his employee. He stepped closer to the girl. She didn't even look at him. She didn't care at all. It was as if Daon was not in this dimension. Certainly, when you are backed into a corner as a human being, you don't believe anyone, and therefore don't say anything. All such a person wants is to be left alone and never touched again, to live his own life without such feelings again. Gwyn stood looking at the girl for a while, then he lifted her face and looked directly into her eyes. Then the man, with a smile on his face, inquired if what she could say was true. He fixed her hair behind her ear. She didn't look at him for a while longer, but then she raised her beautiful eyes, thinking things over. Then in a quiet voice she told the gentleman that it was right. She could speak. Gwyn, hearing this, immediately smiled. He was very pleased that she had done it after all. After a while, as night fell outside, the girl was already sitting in her little den. She was sewing something when suddenly a gentleman came to her. When she saw him, she immediately stopped and looked at the man. He said in an indignant voice that he had asked her to rest, but the girl replied that she had a free moment, so she decided to do some work. Then Gwyn sighed heavily and wondered what was the matter with this Viscount, for he must know in order to make sense of it all. And in fact, after Daon finally did speak, that man's arguments had lost their weight, so no one believed him. However, Gwyn very much doubted that he was the kind of person who could give up so easily. The girl, continuing to sew up the thing, said it had been sold to this man once. He looked at her and immediately asked how this could have happened. Daon was silent for a while, remembering those terrible events. But then she said there was a war in her country. Her mother told her to run away, so she boarded a ship for smugglers. The ship was caught in a huge storm. When she was washed ashore, she was captured by pirates and sold to this very Viscount. Gwyn scratched the back of his head. He hadn't expected to hear such a heartwarming story and wondered, did she really go on that ship alone? Dawn said, all perfectly correct. She was only 10 years old at the time. Then he inquired whether it was true that she had run away from the Viscount when she was 13 and had met Dalbury afterward. The girl said that was exactly what happened, and Gwyn thought about how she was actually very lucky to have met Dalbury. There was no kinder nobleman in their kingdom than this man, and he was curious as to why she had fled her country alone. He had to hang on to that now, however, and immediately the man inquired, did that Viscount treat her badly? Daon stared at him for a while, and then looked away and said she wasn't sure, for then she dismissed all her feelings and emotions. Gwyn walked over to her and sat directly across from her. He wanted to hear a really truthful answer. However, the girl became very uncomfortable because of this. She averted her gaze and asked him not to arouse her feelings. The prince reached his hand out to her and afterward moved over and kissed her forehead. She immediately started to look away and asked him not to. But the man continued to insist. He apologized to her for being so pushy, but said that he would certainly not give up on her so easily. Gwyn said he wanted to get to know her better, so there was absolutely no point in her holding back her emotions, feelings, and experiences. When Daon heard this, she had some hope, but it faded rather quickly, so the girl turned away from him again. Gwyn immediately reached for her lips to kiss her, before saying that if she wasn't around, he couldn't stay sane. And then the man kissed the girl passionately and tenderly at the same time. Tears were streaming down her cheeks because she had let herself give in to her emotions. But soon she pulled him away from her and told him that if he was so reluctant to have her out of his life, he'd better keep his distance like she'd asked. Gwyn moved away from her and smiled happily, wondering when her birthday was even. Gwyn moved away from her and smiled happily, wondering when her birthday was even. The girl was a little surprised by such a question, so she did not answer it at once. When Gwyn asked if she knew the date, she said it was her birthday on November 27th. Then, smiling, he said he would be sure to remember it. And then he got up and started to walk toward the exit. Before the door opened, however, he said that it was too cold in this place, so she could live safely in the room next to his. But the girl, without looking at him, replied that she was perfectly fine in this place too, so he needn't worry. In fact, Daon was still a little embarrassed after what had happened, and Gwyn asked indignantly, does she really want to freeze to death? After all, their winters are very harsh. He immediately thought of the fact that this girl was definitely not the type who would easily obey him. So he needed to come up with his own approach to her character. He looked her straight in the eye and told her that he had traveled a lot and had acquired various souvenirs from all over the world, and if you looked hard enough, you might even find something from the East. Seeing her interested face, he immediately said he could show them to her sometime, and he himself was very pleased that she had taken his bait after all. Gwyn stepped closer to her again and held out his hand, wondering if he had piqued her interest with those words. Dawn pondered for a while on whether it was the right thing to do, but then she still held out her hand and said that indeed she was interested. He said that was very well, and in that case he would organize a museum especially for her, and they would not let anyone else in. He also wondered if it might be much better for her to sleep in her room tonight after all, since the forecast was clearly not going to be very warm. The girl continued to remain silent, but she soon agreed, and the two of them set off in the direction of the manor. Shortly thereafter, as evening fell and Gwyn returned to his office, an aide came to see him. Jathan came to him and told him that it was exactly as he had foreseen. Viscount Zirgok had walked outside Dawn's room that night. Gwyn at this moment asked in a quiet voice, "Maybe we should kill him during the hunt and feed the corpse to the wild beasts. Then they won't have any more problems either." However, the aide, upon hearing this, immediately became indignant and told him not to say such things. The aide said that high status and riches are not important at all, but it is the king's trust that is very important. The prince thought for a while, and after that, he asked if he could give Dawn a god after all. However, when he heard this, he was very surprised and said that she was the head cook after all, and it would look rather strange. But Gwyn said that in addition to being a cook, she is also his woman. And even with so many high-ranking aristocrats looking at her, her expression didn't change at all, and he could see it himself. The aide agreed with him and said that's the point. You see, she's not so weak that she needs a guard. She can fend for herself. Gwyn looked at him in surprise and asked, "Is it really, if you follow his logic, that the king is weak because of the fact that he even has his own guard?" Jafar thought about it and realized he had said a little too much, so he didn't answer anything more. And Gwyn said that sometimes even the strong need to be protected, and if they are aware of danger, certain measures should definitely be taken. Jafar immediately inquired how many soldiers should be appointed, and the man replied that he did not need many, but only one knight. When the aide heard this, he was very surprised and couldn't believe that she would actually need to appoint a knight. Gwyn explained that they couldn't know what to expect from the Viscount, so they needed to be reassured. The man replied that he would appoint, but inquired as to who exactly was needed. Then the man said to appoint Rune, and Jafar became very angry and suggested that it would be better to appoint the same servant to the place instead of appointing the most professional one. He suggested that Rob, who is just as good, might be better appointed to the role. But Gwyn said he was too flashy and someone calmer was needed. Jafar wanted to say something else, but Gwyn insisted and said that he thought Rune would be a good fit for Dawn. He explained that he thought so because it was the man who had found her in the forest. The assistant, hearing this, immediately thought about it and realized that he had indeed been a bit testy. Then, sighing heavily, he said that he didn't know that for sure, and Gwyn suggested asking him in that case. Jafar still hesitated and wondered if he really needed to appoint Rune. Gwyn, smiling, said that this was the man he had brought, after all, and wondered if he really thought he would question his choice. After that, he looked away, and also said that he trusted Rune because he was an honest and calm young man, so he didn't need to worry. Jafar looked away and said he didn't know, because to be honest, he was really worried about the whole thing. Looking down, he wondered if it would definitely be all right, for he doubted the rightness of this choice. Then the prince spoke up and asked, "Is it true that many now think that the master to whom he devoted his life was seduced by some slave girl there?" Seeing the surprised look on his assistant's face, he said that at the very least he was absolutely sure of it, and asked if he was right in assuming such things. Jafar answered nothing to this, for surely he must not say such things to his master. But Gwyn looked at him in surprise and asked if he doubted him too. The boy immediately started waving his head from side to side and said that he did not. He had never doubted him and would never doubt him. Then the man asked, "What is he still afraid of so much that he doesn't even want to realize the factor that this is the best option?" Jafar replied nothing to this. Then the man asked that he should not make him repeat himself. He said that yes, he was the first woman he had ever been interested in so much, so a man should understand and accept that fact. Of course, Gwyn was well aware that his assistant was still a stubborn man who wouldn't recognize Dawn as a woman for anything. However, the man simply bowed and started to walk away to fulfill the prince's orders after all. And before he was finally out the door, Gwyn said that he always gathers only stubborn people around him. And after that, the man left. Shortly afterward, Lycia gathered. They're all at yet another event where the aristocrats were dancing and drinking. That's where the Vicomte came, of course. He was sitting at the table drinking his alcohol when suddenly he saw something strange. Gwyn walked over to him and held out another bottle of liquor for him to drink. The Viscount was very wary. He didn't understand what this ostentatious way of mending their relationship was. Looking around, he noticed that absolutely everyone was looking at them, and if he refused, he might anger the prince. So he agreed to that cup of alcohol after all and drank some. And at that moment, Gwyn leaned closer to him and told him not to dare touch her. The Viscount was of course angered by these words, and he said through clenched teeth that she had originally belonged to him. So he would complain to the king about it and take it back. Well, Gwyn, smiling, said that only if he could get home at all after that alcohol, then of course he could carry out his threats. He left this bottle of alcohol on his desk. The Viscount immediately blushed and began to feel rather strange, and Gwyn left at that moment. After a while he came to his table again and, turning to his assistant, said that the Vicomte was very quickly intoxicated all of a sudden, and also inquired, was it because of his age? The Viscount was furious, but he was having trouble keeping himself on his feet. He knocked over the rest of the glass of alcohol and wanted to do something to the prince, but he couldn't. Gwyn moved closer to him and told him that he was sure to kill him someday, he just had to wait a little longer. The Viscount then finally got up from the table and said that he had soiled all his clothes, so he would go and change. But the prince just stood there and continued to drink alcohol. He thought of the Vicomte as a rather nasty fellow and felt even more sorry for the girl who had lived with him for 3 whole years. At that moment, 2 men approached him from behind, and one of them inquired of Gwyn, had he not brought that beautiful girl this day? And the other, with a smile on his face, said they were still waiting for her to come out, because she really was stunning. They also said that last night a lot of fuss was made about her, and one of the men unfortunately could not come to see her. So they were really hoping that she would also come this time. All the people immediately started asking for Gwyn to show her that day as well, but the man didn't say anything back. He walked back to his seat and sat down with the king, saying that she should only please his eyes, so he saw no point in making a show of it all. The king suddenly looked at him briefly and wondered how long his feelings for her would last. He'd bet on just a few months, because it couldn't be otherwise. However, Gwyn said with a smile that he might as well not hope for that, because even if she got bored of it, he certainly wouldn't give her to a man. He glimpsed at him, but quickly looked away, for he felt very awkward, not realizing how he could have guessed it in the first place. And Gwyn immediately realized that apparently, yes, he was interested in him too, so he must defend her to the last. He leveled himself and began to survey everything in the room with his eyes, then shifted his gaze to the glass of alcohol that had spilled over onto the table where Viscount was sitting. He kept thinking that if he left her to ruin, he would definitely have nothing to worry about. Yet he still worried. This Viscount, unlike other Viscounts, easily bows to power and authority, but he can't give up his obsession so easily either. So after some more time, Gwyn got up from the table and started to leave. At this very time, in a special back room, which was the kitchen, Dawn was just sitting and cooking something in her large cauldron. Next to the girl, of course, stood her guard, when suddenly they heard someone at the door. They immediately turned toward the exit, and Dawn was very surprised to see the man who had gone inside. It was the angry Vicomte. He was approaching her and was about to say something when he saw a man blocking his way. He immediately asked what he was even doing and how some knight like him dared to get in his way. He continued to shout as he looked at the knight and said that he was as bold a man just like his master. He then took a swing at the man and punched him in the face, telling him to get out of the way and not to get in his way. Dawn, When she saw this, immediately stood up and started to walk as close to the knight as possible, but soon stopped. Then, plucking up courage, she turned to him and asked him to step aside after all, you see, or else this Viscount would certainly not get away from them. However, the knight continued to stand still, even though a bruise was already appearing on his cheek, and he said he wasn't going anywhere. The other cooks were sitting on the ground and catching their breath a little, for their work was not easy after all. Dion turned to them and told them they could rest and leave the rest to her. The maids did not argue and began to leave at once. They apologized for the fact that she would have to do everything alone, but the girl did not react in any way. Before the Viscount came in, her knight came in instead of the maids and continued to stand near the entrance. The girl, meanwhile, drew a whole bucket of water and afterward poured it into a mug for herself to drink a little. In fact, she thought it was the most wonderful thing to drink water alone after a hard day's work. She didn't need more than that. Dawn sat by the hot fire where the meal was still cooking and sipped her water. She was just going to slowly drift toward her old age and die somewhere where no one would be. She was going to do it all in such a way that it would feel as if she had never existed in this world before. It would be calmer for her that way. However, Eskar swiftly flew into her life and left an indelible mark there. He was a rather strong man, a cheerful, but at the same time, scary man. She couldn't predict his next move, so all his actions were a mystery to her. It was actually quite fun to play with him, and it was the first time she had felt such emotions. The girl also realized that she was safe in his territory. Whoever is looking at her is protecting her, even though she is a simple servant. Gwyn has shown her some respect, and perhaps she is being overly naive, but so far he has kept every promise he has made. His kisses were very passionate and unusual for her, as if he wanted to share absolutely his whole life with her. The day she felt his lips for the first time, her heart straight up stopped for a few minutes. For him, however, Dion thinks it's probably just a game, since she's not the first woman he's played with like this. No doubt he must have done the same to others, so the girl can't count on anything. Just as she was about to finish preparing her dishes, the Vicomte walked in, but the knight wasn't about to back out after all. The man stood behind her and shouted loudly. He called her a complete idiot, and he was angry that all this time she had only pretended to be mute. He looked over his shoulder, seeing Dawn there, and wondered if she wanted to talk to him at all. He also called her various uncultured words. The Viscount kept yelling and said that he had already noticed that absolutely any man could suit her. Dalbury, Alvin, Eskar. He cared for her so much, and she ended up just running away. Dawn, however, did not answer him. She just stood there and looked at the man with a cold gaze that was filled with hatred. This man was very nasty, rude, and with dirty hands, a man she thought was perfect for her. This man was the outright personification, in Dawn's opinion, of her own sins, so the girl immediately began to move closer to them. When Viscount saw this, he was immediately overjoyed, and said that she finally realized that she belonged to him. So with a smile on his face, he asked her to go straight to him. He took hold of the knight's arm again, trying to pull him away, telling her to come back to him, for he had found her and would not let her escape again. That Viscount was the most disgusting person. Even when he smiled, he looked disgusting. He said that he was a generous person, so he could forgive her this time. Dion lowered her head down with a heavy sigh and realized that this man was still trapped in his own obsession, an ugly old man who made her outright sick. She would like to put an end to the past that bound her to this horrible man, for she is no longer a defenseless 10-year-old girl. The Viscount continued to smirk and offered to leave that very evening, and added that it would be necessary to thank Eskar properly for it. He said that the man had taken good care of his thing, but he should take it back already. The girl, meanwhile, was coming closer and closer to them. When she was quite close to the knight, he started yelling at her and asked her to stop even moving. Thereupon he looked at the Viscount with his most vicious look, and requested that he, in turn, should leave the place right at that moment. The Viscount, hearing this, became even more angry and asked him what he was even saying, and how dare he address him so disrespectfully. But the knight got even more angry and told him to leave nicely, or otherwise he would have to use force. The man, as if not hearing his words, swung at the knight again and asked how dare he dare to do such a thing. However, the knight managed to block his blow. The Viscount was a little surprised. He stepped away from the knight and said he had no right to touch the king's faithful servant, and began to provoke him by telling him to hit him. He also said that if he did so, he would see what would happen to him and his master afterward. But the knight looked at him and did nothing, for he knew perfectly well that there would certainly be consequences afterward. Daon at this moment came as close as possible to the table on which the apples and the knife were lying, so she carefully picked up that very knife. The girl watched the situation carefully, and after taking the knife, she hid it behind her back and approached the knight. She touched his body with her hand, making sure he paid attention to her, and said she had already made her choice. When the knight saw this, he was very surprised. However, he had nothing else to do but let the girl pass. Daon, at this point, hiding the knife behind her back, went along with Viscount, who angrily grabbed her arm and led her away into the street. They had already passed through the gate at that moment and were in the forest. Then she thought that it had to end right then and there, because it couldn't be otherwise. As the Vicomte continued to lead her, Gwyn suddenly appeared behind them. He intercepted the girl and pulled her to him by the waist. Daon didn't expect this when she saw him. However, when she looked up, she saw him immediately and realized that he had come to save her. They were silent for a while. Then Gwyn took her by the waist and pulled her closer to him, as if to embrace her, at which point he looked straight at the Viscounts. The girl immediately wondered where her knife was, and had no way of knowing, for it was not in her hand. Then a man who had already come to his senses after what had happened finally approached them, and turning to Gwyn, began to call him names. However, the prince was not going to make small talk with him for long. As soon as the Vicomte came close enough, he simply slapped him across the face with all his might. The man didn't expect it at all, so he even fell to the ground from such a huge blow. Gwyn looked down at him then and said that he had already warned him that a man dare not touch Daon, hadn't he? He moved closer to the Viscount, who began screaming again with a bloody nose, and said that she belonged to him and was his employee who must live with him. Gwyn didn't even listen to the end of his sentence, only kicked him in the face. The man cried out again from this blow and began to hold his head, which was beginning to hurt incredibly badly. Then the prince turned to the Knight of the Fleece and asked him to give him the weapons. The man immediately ran up to him and handed over his sword. Gwyn drew it and moved closer to the Viscount to do exactly what he intended. But at that moment, more people approached them. It was the prince and his guards. He asked that the men stop doing that, and that Escar move away from the Viscount. As soon as the man lifted his head up with his bloody face and saw Prince Zack, he was immediately overjoyed. Zack came closer to them and started shouting loudly. He said that he had captured Uranus by force, and Viscount Zergok was the king's loyal servant. So he is the messenger. Daon, when she heard all this, immediately looked at the man in surprise, for she did not know such details. The man continued to shout and said that even though Gwyn was well aware of this information, he still continued to point his sword at him and planned to kill the king's envoy. When Gwyn heard all these words, he still stood motionless for a while, and after he reconsidered his actions, he lowered his weapon from the Viscount. Zack let out a sigh of relief when he saw this, for he wasn't sure if his words would work on the prince. Gwyn, however, was certainly not deterred by all this. He put his weapon away for a few seconds and then swung it at the Viscount again. When Zack saw this, he immediately became worried. He had already gone to ask him to stop, but everything was happening too fast for him to react. Gwyn did not hesitate to chop off the Viscount's hand. The man himself did not immediately realize what had happened because of the shock. However, when he turned his head to the side and saw that he was now missing most of his arm, he began to scream loudly, still from fright, but also at the same time from pain. Daon, when she saw all this, couldn't even contain her surprise on her face. She really hadn't expected the prince to do such a thing. And Gwyn, in turn, smiling smugly, said that he hadn't planned to kill him. However, he couldn't leave him the hand that had touched his woman, so he paid him back. When Zack saw all this, He was even speechless for a while. He, of course, started blaming the man for all of this and didn't understand how he could do that. The knight, on the other hand, who was also standing next to them all, realized that this was all going to end very badly, so he needed to take some action. Zack had his knights running up to him at that moment, and he ordered them to lead the man away. He looked incredibly angry. At that moment, the knights immediately began to help the Viscount stand up. He kept shouting and saying that he would never forget it. And Gwyn, without thinking long, walked over to the girl and, taking her hand, began to walk away again as if nothing had happened. As he passed Zack, the latter said they would discuss the whole situation in the morning. He himself, Gwyn, and his slave must be present. The prince immediately thought of the fact that the man probably wanted to separate them, so she told him to forget about it. And Zack didn't say anything to that, because Gwyn continued to hold the girl's hand, and the two of them walked off in the direction of the manor back. Soon after he led her into the kitchen, he closed the doors behind him and, leaning the girl against the wall, moved closer. It was very hot in the kitchen, for the stove was still hot, and so they were both sweating. Gwyn was also incredibly angry. He turned to the girl and asked if she was really going with him. The girl then said that was right. She was going to go. Then he looked her straight in the eye and asked why, for he was shocked. Dawn didn't answer anything to that. She even took her head to the side to avoid looking at him. The man got even more angry about this and asked, "Is she really not going to answer that question for him?" The girl didn't respond to that either. She waved her head from side to side as a sign of rejection. Gwyn was beyond furious. He grabbed her head with his hands and started screaming, telling her to look at him and not to shut up. But the girl didn't react to it in any way. She even hid the emotion of her fear of this moment. Then, after calming down a bit, the man said that he just wants her to be happy around him. She can cry, she can laugh, she can be selfish. That's what it means to be human, and he wants her to get to that point as well. He wondered in amazement if it was so hard for her to do this, since for ordinary people these were the simplest expressions of emotion. Dawn was silent for a while longer. Then she said in a sad voice that she didn't want to be happy. Gwyn was very surprised at that answer, but he knew it was to be expected. He wondered if that was why she had gone after that awful Viscount. The girl explained that she didn't mean to do anything like that, but was just going to settle something with him. Gwyn was so furious that he even slammed his fist against the wall with all his might. However, Dawn didn't even twitch, as if she was used to such behavior. Then, clenching his teeth, he told the girl to remember that if she ever left for another man, he would raise an entire army and march on his land. Dawn, lowering his head even lower, said that he actually didn't want to let her go just because of his curiosity. So there was no need to say such loud words that he would regret later. She said that she could not trust him completely. Then the man was very surprised by this answer and took her by the face and started kissing her. He was the one who mostly took the initiative, and the girl was a little surprised. However, after thinking carefully, she began to respond to his kisses, and they stood like that for a while. They intertwined their tongues, and those kisses were very passionate, which not only Gwyn liked, but Dawn did too. But soon his hands began to slowly unbutton the girl's work uniform over her breasts. They continued kissing, and Gwyn gradually began to get his hands under her skirt. Dawn, of course, became uncomfortable with this, so her hands began to tremble. And as soon as Gwyn noticed it, he let go of her immediately. The girl was shaking, and there was a bruise on her arm because of how hard he was holding her. The man picked up on his mistake, so he quickly kissed her where the bruise was and told her that he had made a promise after all and shouldn't have done that. Correcting her form, he said it didn't matter whether she trusted him or not. The only thing she needed to believe was that he would live much longer than she did. He will live longer than her under any circumstances, and when the girl dies, he will take her corpse. Dawn was a little surprised to hear this. However, afterward the man hugged her tightly and asked her to remember it once and for all. He said it didn't matter how old she was, whether she was alive or already dead, she would still absolutely belong to him. They hugged for a while longer, And then Gwyn let her go and left her completely alone in bewilderment after all that had happened. Gwyn left the room at this point and started heading straight for his office to settle some more matters. And at that moment, an aide suddenly ran up to him. He said that Viscount Zergok had a good reputation, but Gwyn pretended not to know what he was talking about. Jathan raised his voice and said that if he met with the king, things could end very badly for him after the situation. He asked that the Lord allow the prince to meet with Dawn, for if their relationship with him deteriorated, they would clearly be at a disadvantage. He said she could be forcibly taken away, and wondered if that was what he wanted. But Gwyn looked at him and smirked, and asked if it was true that he would be glad if it happened. Jathan did not deny it. He said it was true, but he was afraid of what would happen next, and asked the master not to look at him as if he were the villain of the place. He also asked that Gwyn would eventually return to his usual calm, for that would be much better for him. After thinking about all of this for a bit, the man came to Zach's room, quickly opened the door, and told him to gather his things. A man who was sitting at a small table drinking wine looked at him in surprise and asked him how dare he treat his guests like that. Gwyn, however, stepped closer to him and asked what right a guest had to lay eyes on the host's woman. He was the one who brought that man to this place, so he asks that Zach take responsibility and take him away. Zach looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted him to do it right then. Gwyn, moving closer to the window, told him to do it the next morning as soon as the sun came up. And Zach at that moment turned to the servants who were in the room and asked that they come out. As soon as they slammed the door behind them, Zach immediately inquired if the girl was okay. Gwyn was very surprised when he heard this, for he could not think that the first prince could be interested in a mere servant girl. But after some time of silence, he said he was actually more worried about Gwyn than Zergok. He looked at the man and said also that he was the one who was used to and liked to take by force what he wished, and he was also a rude and ill-mannered man. Gwyn was by this point more than a little pissed off, and turning to Zach, said that only dogs drool on other people's stuff. This phrase made Zach himself angry, and he said that his foul mouth was the reason his father put a cross on the man. However, he still remains quite gracious. Turning his back to the man, he asked as the man remembered to treat the royal family with respect. Gwyn then, smiling, bowed before him and said that he respected him very much, and called him Prince Zach, and with dear royalty, Artus. However, he's still not immature enough to get involved with a lower-class woman, so he thinks it shouldn't be a problem. When Zach heard this, he was very surprised. However, the man went on and said that he could meet her the next morning at 7. He would give her about 10 minutes with him. The man then started to turn around and walk away, and Zach asked if he could give him a 20, but the man insisted, and they agreed on that. After that, Gwyn went outside, and all the time he was thinking just about Dawn. He still remembered the warmth of her body. He was actually a little hurt that she had said she couldn't trust him. But he really should have expected something like that. However, he's still going to make his way to her heart, no matter what. No matter how hard he has to work, he's going to get his way. The next morning, as they had agreed, Zach approached the manor from the other side and waited just for the girl. Dawn came as Gwyn had promised. She was in her work uniform and in a completely bad mood. As soon as the prince saw her, he immediately looked in that direction. He didn't understand how Dawn could behave like this in front of a member of the royal family. The man did not think there was a servant who would not try to flatter him, so, turning to her, he said he had heard that the Earl of Dalbury had been very fond of her when he was still alive. Zach also said that Eskar is only an invader at this point, so he had one question. He inquired if she still wanted to stay in Orank. The girl did not respond to this in any way. She continued to stand at a distance from the man and simply remained silent. He waited for a while, and then said that it might be a complicated matter, but if she wanted to leave Eskar, he could hand her over to Xerox. Zach began to watch her behavior carefully and noticed that she didn't keep her head low like the other servants, but she didn't make eye contact either. He then turned his attention to her neck, where small bruises remained, and immediately assumed that Gwyn must have kissed her there. In fact, Gwyn is a man who takes what he wants. He's a stranger to love, so he'll probably get rid of Dawn as soon as he gets tired of her. And in that case, in Zach's opinion, the girl would have only regrets. She would wait for him like his little sister Anna. He was silent for a while, then he said he had one suggestion for the girl. If she wanted, the royal family could take her in. He told her all the details the girl needed to know and asked that she think hard about the offer before making a final decision. When Zach was about to leave, Dawn said that if she had a choice, she wanted to stay in that place. He was a little angry and surprised by this. Then he said that he understood perfectly well that Gwyn was an interesting man, handsome and even rich. However, he's certainly not going to love her just one and for real. He also believes that she is well aware of his reputation as a womanizer. The girl lowered her head and said she knew it perfectly well, and he inquired in a surprised voice, "Does she really love him?" But the girl immediately replied that there was nothing like that. The man was even more surprised and asked her why she didn't want to leave. Dawn replied that he was simply the only person she could trust. Zach was very shocked. He smiled then and wondered if he was the one she trusted. The girl put her head down and said that was right, for he was talking about how if she even died, he would take her corpse. Zach was puzzled and couldn't believe that he had actually said he would take the young girl's corpse. But when he saw the sad expression on her face, he immediately realized that those words must have somehow reminded her of her homeland, in the sense that he would take care of her until the day he died. Dawn said he promised he would protect her all the time. That's why she's staying in this place with him. Soon afterward, Zach left, for their time was up, and Gwyn came up, opened the wagon for him, and wished him an easy and happy journey. As Zach got into the wagon, he thought about how there was so much more he would have liked to ask her, but for some reason he didn't. This girl absolutely trusts Gwyn, however. He was unsure if the man really wouldn't leave her. Before leaving, Zach called a man over and told him that Anna kept turning down suitors and was expecting him. He wondered if the man knew about it. Gwyn, upon hearing this, was surprised to say the least because Zach had told him so, and then asked in a cold voice that she should just get married already and forget about him. The man wondered, did he really not want so badly to be her husband and become closer to the royal family? The prince was shocked and asked why exactly he had to do that, and said that of course he didn't want to. But Zach kept insisting and said that there were even rumors around the estate that she was pregnant with his child. His sister was very depressed and losing weight rapidly, and he didn't even dare to comfort her. Gwyn smiled and said he swore to God that he didn't want to get under her skirt and he didn't need ballast. He explained that he didn't want to be prevented from playing, so he definitely wouldn't do that. When Zach heard that phrase, he got very angry, couldn't stand it, and grabbed the man by his clothes, pulling him to him. He called him a complete idiot. But Gwyn didn't even pay much attention to it, and only said that the guy knew absolutely nothing about his sister, and wondered, did he still think she was poor and defenseless? Zach's grip on Zach slowly began to loosen, and the man also said that the pregnancy myth also surprised him. Gwyn also asked, had he really only come because she had asked him to? Zach didn't answer, so they were silent for a while, just staring at each other. And afterward, the man asked that he not tell the royal family about Dawn. The man, hearing this, immediately smirked and said that even her father can't influence her. He's already telling her to make him her husband, even though he can't stand Gwyn. He also said that of course the guy is an idiot and a jerk, but his status is still worthy. But the man, with only a wave of his hands, said that if he became her husband, their country wouldn't last a year in the end. Zach had calmed down a bit by then and smiled and said that even a wild animal could be tamed and made to obey you. After that, he finally did let go of Gwyn and thought about how this guy was the perfect opportunity to restrain the aristocrats who wanted to rebel. If you tame this guy, he will be very even useful to the royal family, because Eskar will accept a marriage proposal sooner or later. Because there isn't a single woman in this world who can take him in, and Anna can do it. Well, Gwyn sighed heavily and said that the princess was very smart, and even without her brother she wouldn't sit still. He wanted the man to listen to him. Zach, however, turned to the coachman and told them to start driving at last, and the wagon moved. Soon after, he rode outside the castle, and in fact, Zack knew very well that Anna had a harmful temper, but that was only because she was still young. If the girl were to marry, that she would reform, and there should be absolutely no problems. However, he still felt rather strange at the same time. In fact, it was that woman who made all this happen. Dawn, she's got a face like she's not interested in me at all. So he wondered if she would change Gwyn, or if she herself would eventually change under his character, or if perhaps Zack should give this girl to Zergok after all and not bother. There were still many doubts in the man's mind for a long time, and at this very moment, people were unloading packages in the castle. There were many crates and barrels that held Govin's weapons. Behind it all stood and watched. In fact, examining what he managed to buy, it is clear that the money was not wasted after all, and he was pleased with his catch. Soon after, he helped some people bring in boxes and saw Dawn sitting nearby. This girl, opening drawers, took out various interesting things and scrutinized them. He immediately smiled and thought that she had finally found some entertainment for herself. He stepped closer to her and asked her how it would be best to decorate them, by country, or to divide the jewelry into certain types. The girl immediately looked at him in surprise, then considered his questions for a while, and said it would be best to go country by country. He, smiling, opened one of the boxes and pulled out some jewelry from there, and thought about the fact that she had probably decided this question already in advance. Gwyn held it out to her and told her that it would be perfect for her. The girl immediately took it in her hands and examined it from all sides, and he thought, watching her, that the girl was definitely having a lot of fun. Dawn really scrutinized everything that came into her hands, for she was very interested in learning about it all. And the man, as he watched her, he immediately realized that because of how beautiful she looked, he even wanted to touch her face. But he couldn't even think about it, so he quickly pushed the thought away. Gwyn then turned his head to the side and noticed another crate containing a mask of some kind. He put it on his face and, coming closer to the girl, asked if it looked good on him. When the girl looked at it, she immediately said he had put it on upside down. So taking it in her hands, she began to turn it over. She found it a bit funny, so she started smiling. And after that, she suddenly apologized and gave him the mask and started to leave because she was too embarrassed. Gwyn at this point began to smile happily under his mask, for she had touched him after all, even though it was only for a short time. But it still wasn't enough for him. Nothing was enough for him anymore. No matter how much he hugged her, he wanted to give her his whole body and soul. He wanted incredibly badly to be near her and be around her all the time, because that was very important to Gwyn. Soon afterward, they continued to sort through the things he had brought for the museum, and Gwyn said there was a lot to see in this place. He reached into another drawer, and there they saw one very beautiful thing. Dawn immediately took it in her hands and said nothing. However, there was surprise on her face. Seeing the look on her face, he immediately inquired, "Does she really know what it is?" The girl said she did know. Then he came closer to it, and scrutinizing the little thing, inquired what it could be used for at all. The girl said that when a daughter gets married, her mother does a similar thing for her. However, Gwyn still did not understand what it was for, so he asked her. Dawn explained that this is done to make the daughter's life fragrant. They put something that smells good in the pouch to make it fragrant. Then the man, after being silent for a while, told her to take it for herself because her birthday was coming up, so she could consider it a gift. But then he thought about it and said that even though it was still a little early, he would like her to accept it. And Dawn, hearing this, was very surprised and didn't even bother to hide it on her face. Gwyn, seeing the look on her face, said that if she didn't like it, of course she could return it, and there was nothing wrong with that. But she immediately took the thing even tighter and said that not at all. She liked it very much. The girl, with cheeks red with embarrassment, said she would be sure to keep him safe, and Gwyn scrutinized her face. Seeing such an expression for the first time, he was amazed. Usually people are happy with better things, but she was pleased and yet embarrassed by such a simple little thing. It made him feel a little uncomfortable. Then, clenching his fist, he said in a quiet voice that he would in no way make her feel bad, but would instead do his best to make her forget what it was like. As much as the blood pounded in his head, he shouldn't have acted the way he did last night. The reason, for some reason, he didn't push him away, in his opinion, was because she was afraid. There was no doubt that Gwyn was very eager to get her. However, he had no intention of scaring her in any way that would make him feel ashamed. So with his head down, the man said that from now on, he would not touch her without permission, and would also try to keep the distance she wanted. It didn't really matter to him how long it would take at all. But he wanted to wait for the moment when she could finally open her heart to him. Daon is a very valuable person to him, so he will do everything he can to ensure that he doesn't hurt her again. The girl was silent for a while, then said that she agreed to this condition. He breathed a sigh of relief and said that he was going to Galeon for a few days, so he asked her to pack his luggage for him. Daon immediately turned around and started to walk away to fulfill his request, and he remained standing still and only watched her recoil. Gwyn realized that they wouldn't see each other for a while, but despite all that, he would still think about her. After a while, a real snowstorm started outside. Jafar, who had gone out to prepare the wagon, noticed it and was very much surprised. In fact, he could hardly believe that leaving for Galeon would be on such a terrible day. He also hoped very much that nothing bad would happen. Soon after, he turned his head to the side and suddenly saw a girl sitting on the cold ground. It was Dawn, of course. She was dressed in thin clothes, even though it was freezing outside, and was looking up somewhere. Cold balls of steam were coming out of her mouth. Jafar started to walk closer to her and didn't understand what she was doing outside in this cold. He also thought about the fact that from a distance she looked like an abandoned child. Then coming closer, he turned to her and told her that winter was already knocking at the door, so she should save herself. But at that moment, Dawn started to get up from the cold ground and asked that he not speak to her in such a respectful tone, for the man had called her mistress before. Suddenly, Jafar noticed her hands. He knew he had a difficult job to do, but he didn't think it would be this bad. He was silent for a while, then turned away and sighed. He said that the gentleman was in love with her and asked if she thought it was necessary to continue working so hard. The girl, head down, explained that if he lost interest in her, she would still have to work. In that case, there was absolutely no point in quitting her job and pampering herself. Jafar, hearing this, pondered her words and then concluded that it was indeed a wise decision for the maid. She is too clever, and even though he had talked to her only a little, he had come to the conclusion that she would not be able to live a normal life. People with abilities that didn't match their status always caused problems. This is also true for their master, so she simply won't be able to exist like any other normal person because she's not used to it. After a while of silence, Daon wondered when he would be back. In fact, the man had no idea what she was talking about, so he looked at her in surprise. He also didn't know if he could figure out what she meant, so he said her master wasn't coming back, and wondered in surprise if she hadn't heard that at all. Jafar explained that he really liked to travel, and now that the rank situation had stabilized, there was no reason for him to stay in that place. Daon, hearing this, was a little surprised, but she said nothing and did not show it on her face in any way, for she knew perfectly well that she could not hope for anything. They stood in complete silence in the cold for some time. Then Jafar, sighing heavily, said that he was a womanizer. Wherever he went, he was surrounded by women, so perhaps he would forget all about it. The girl, hearing this, said that she understood everything. But it was impossible to read a single emotion on her face, much less understand what she was thinking. When Jafar thought about all this, he realized that the girl had never even tried to run away, except when he was looking out for her. He suggested that perhaps she didn't feel her life was in danger, so she wasn't thinking of running away per se. Then he assumed that was the reason she had lived in that place for 7 whole years, and that she had escaped from Duke Zergok because she had been oppressed there. However, surely these were only his thoughts and guesses. There was too little reason to trust her, so he couldn't even stick to his theories. At that moment, one of the knights suddenly ran up to them, addressing Mr. Jafar. He said that there had been trouble with their lord. The aide, upon hearing this, immediately became wary and went to follow the knight to see what had happened. Certainly Rob never strayed from the gentleman while escorting him, but he didn't understand why the man had come completely alone then. Shortly afterward, when they returned to the manor, they entered the room and saw Gwyn lying on the bed with another knight standing beside him, watching over him. As soon as Jafar saw this, he was very surprised and immediately stopped, and Rob replied that it was all poison. And it was indeed true. There was blood on Gwyn's face, and he lay completely unconscious. Jafar stood for some time, very much surprised, and did not know what to do. Then he turned to the knights and told them to call for a physician at once. But at that moment, as he turned to the side, he suddenly saw Dawn enter their room. When she saw the Lord, she looked very anxious and frightened. In fact, before all this happened, Gwyn was riding through the forest on his horse. However, it started snowing very hard, and he realized that at times like this, he needed to have better equipment. So soon the men turned to Rob and said they would go to the nearest house. The knight was a little surprised but followed his order. In fact, Gwyn had gotten a rather bad feeling while they were driving, so he felt that he should get out of the forest as soon as possible, because then things would get better. However, soon, when he was about to turn the corner, his body was suddenly pierced by some arrow straight into his chest. Sure enough, Gwyn failed to stay on his horse and, bloody, fell to the snow. Rob stopped at once and ran up to his master. He asked him to just hold on, but at that moment the archers started firing at the knight too. He immediately began to beat back their arrows with his sword and called them all idiots. Gwyn was still conscious at that moment and told his knight that it was the first time he had ever been shot with arrows in his life. After that, he pulled out that arrow that pierced his chest and twitched a bit because it really hurt. His entire shirt and uniform were covered in blood. However, at that moment, he examined the arrow carefully and saw the remnants of something red on it. It was not his blood, but poison. Gwyn, when he studied this, immediately turned to his knight and said that these arrows were poisonous, so they should be dealt with as soon as possible. He also ordered that Rob keep alive only one person who could give up the customer. The others must be killed. The man immediately went into action and said that he would fulfill everything as he said. At that moment, Gwyn dressed his wound and started to get up from his seat. It was then that he realized that he had had a bad feeling for a reason as they rode through the forest. However, he was still incredibly curious as to who had done it. He was going to find out who had done it, and he was going to take revenge. As he stood up and interrupted a few warriors, he suddenly felt even worse. The man realized that the poison was spreading too fast, and that was strange enough in his opinion. So he was doubly interested in what kind of poison they were using, for he had not seen such a poison for a long time. The man also assumed that someone had a very big grudge against him, since they had decided to get rid of him in such a way. Soon, when all the warriors were outnumbered, Rob went back to the Lord again, for he saw something lying near the tree with its head bowed. The man was getting worse by the minute. Then Gwyn asked if he had managed to catch anyone alive. Rob replied that he was sorry. He had tried to save at least one life, but the last one had killed himself. Then Gwyn asked that he take his corpse with him, and shortly afterwards he almost passed out. The knight began to carry out his orders as quickly as possible. He placed him behind him on his horse and rode back towards the manor. Gwyn was almost unconscious by now. The man thought about the fact that even if he regretted it, he would like to see Dawn smiling brightly before he died. And immediately after that thought, he finally lost his consciousness. And so, while the new lord was on the verge of life and death, there was a very tense atmosphere in the castle. And there were far more problems in his ancestral territory of Gallion than in the recently captured Orank. Jafar sat by his master's side and never left his side. He was well aware that if word got out that his life was in danger, his enemies would definitely bare their fangs. He needed to send armed soldiers to Gallion first, and leave the remaining soldiers to defend Orank. When Orank fell into the Lord's hands, the situation was very unstable, so there was no denying that people could rebel. So a man needs to order his servants to keep their mouths shut and act as if nothing happened. Gwyn was still in bed at this time, hot and cold at times. His wound was bandaged, and his aide was hardly ever away. After a while, the man finally opened his eyes. In a quiet voice, he said that his whole body was on fire. Jafar, who remained seated next to him, immediately turned his attention to him. Gwyn opened up and said that he was very hot. Then he touched his head and said that it also hurt incredibly badly. The man was covered in sweat. Jafar, observing his behavior, sighed heavily and thought about how he always acted calm, even when things were bad. So nothing had changed, and that pleased him. He immediately ran up to him and told him that this is what happens when he doesn't listen to him and walks around unguarded. After that, he covered him with the blanket again, for that was what was needed. For myself, I was simply disgusted. However, he soon found his strength and sat up on the bed. Then Jafar said that he had been attacked, and also asked if he remembered it. Gwyn, breathing heavily, said that he remembered. He had been shot with arrows and added that he didn't have amnesia, so he might not worry. But the man could not sit for long. He fell down on the bed again, for he was too weak. Jafar, seeing this, immediately smirked and said that he was doing fine so far. He also asked the man to listen to him sometimes, for he would not give bad advice. However, Gwyn ignored his words and asked that the boy bring him a report. The aide asked if he could get some rest and leave all the business for later. But the man, of course, was unwilling to listen to him and told him to just give him a general report. He wants to study it before he goes back to bed. Jafar continued to stand his ground and said with a heavy sigh that there was no problem with Galeon and Orang so far. He also added that they have not yet found who led the attackers. No one in the Empire knows yet that he was assassinated, and that's for the best. Gwyn protested, however, and said that there was one person who knew about it. The assistant agreed with him and said that it was the one who had carried out the assassination attempt. Then the man looked at him, smiling, and wondered if they were going to give him a funeral or pretend he hadn't survived. Jafar immediately laughed and said that if they really did that, Princess Anne would be the first to rush to the estate to bid him farewell. Then Gwyn, turning away in the other direction, suggested settling on the idea of a funeral. In fact, even their fearless master tried to avoid Princess Anna by all means. She is King Honor's favorite, and if provoked, it could prove to be a series of troubles in the future. Gwyn was silent for a while, then said that the man said no one knew about it, and added that the enemy must be very anxious whether he survived at all. The aide looked at the gentleman with interest and immediately wondered what he was even up to. The prince replied that as soon as any invitation comes to him, he should reply that he is very busy and unfortunately will not be able to attend that event. He also added that if anyone responded to this, the names of these people should be written down. After that, he asked the assistant to give him some water because he was not feeling well at all. Jathan immediately poured him a glass of water and handed it to the gentleman. Then Gwyn asked how the girl was. The guy immediately replied that it was business as usual with her. He said, smiling, that it was very good. This really surprised his aide, because even though he was on the brink of life and death, the woman he cares for isn't worried about him at all. And that's a good thing for Gwyn, apparently. He immediately asked if he needed to call the girl over, and Gwyn, lying back on the bed, said he didn't have to do that. He didn't want her to see him like this. Jathan was a little surprised at such an answer, but said nothing. He bowed and said that in that case, he too would go and leave him alone. Before the man left, however, he said he felt like she became even less talkative afterward. Gwyn immediately asked if he was talking about Dawn. The man agreed and said that after he had passed out, she had not uttered a single word during those 4 days. Gwyn turned around and didn't answer anything, but just started smiling. The aide was very surprised at this reaction, for he did not understand what there was to be happy about. Then Gwyn also said that for Dion's birthday, he wanted to give her his herbs or tofu to put in that pouch, so he had the assistant ask her exactly what she would like. He also said that if the girl doesn't say anything back, he asks her to bring her to him. He thinks she will tell him in person. Soon, when Jathan finally did leave the room, he turned his head to the side and saw a girl standing off to the side, looking in his direction. Taking a closer look, he realized it was Dawn, of course, and couldn't believe that she had been waiting for him all this time under the door. He immediately remembered her frightened face as soon as she had seen Gwyn in such a terrible state, and couldn't believe that she had been waiting under the door ever since. She must have been standing there all this time hoping the gentleman would wake up. She was so worried that she was afraid to go over to take care of him because she realizes she is a foreigner. Looking at it that way, Jafan realized that she was a very calm and practical woman who wouldn't pry into things that weren't hers. Soon she started to get closer, and the man noticed her legs. She was limping, and it was because they were very swollen. As soon as she passed Jathan, they nodded to each other in greeting. In fact, the man thought of the fact that the girl did not know when the Lord would return, so she sat and waited for him that day, and continued to wait for him in that icy hallway, even though her clothes were very thin and her feet hurt badly. But she doesn't even pay attention to all this pain, because her attention is only on the master and his well-being. Even though Dawn was so worried, she still continued to stand and wait. The deputy thought about the fact that someone like her would be loyal and by her side if her husband was captured by enemies or taken hostage. Even if he goes missing or dies on the battlefield, she will defend her territory and endure without losing heart. Then suddenly a thought occurred to Jathan, namely that this was the kind of girl the gentleman wanted for his ideal wife. Then suddenly he laughed to himself and thought about the fact that the image of his ideal wife was a maid from another country who always kept silent in case of anything. Then the man approached Dawn and said that the master had asked to ask her what herbs or flowers she would like for her birthday. The girl, hearing this, was genuinely surprised. Then the man opened the door to his room and told her to tell him all this in person. Dawn, not thinking long, went straight into the room and saw Gwyn lying quietly on his bed asleep. She immediately walked over to his bed and sat down in the chair next to it. The whole time she sat there, even though it was already dark outside and she hadn't even eaten anything. Thus a whole day passed, and the next morning Gwyn was still asleep and Dawn was sitting up. The girl adjusted the blanket from him, for it was getting too cold outside, and asked in a quiet voice if he would give her a rosemary. Some time had passed since then, and Gwyn was feeling much better, so he had even started going outside. As soon as the man stepped out into the courtyard, he immediately saw Dawn on the steps. She was again very lightly dressed, even though it was freezing outside. He immediately walked over to the girl and threw his coat over her shoulders. She immediately started wiping her tears, and he saw that and thought she was incredibly cute. The girl sat silent for a while, and afterward, blushing a little, said that she was not cold at all, so she did not need a coat. But Gwyn, after looking at her, only stepped closer and tied a bow across her chest to cover absolutely every part of her body. Afterward, he said it snowed heavily outside, and he thinks it's going to be a frosty and very snowy winter this year. Dawn looked at him in surprise, and for a while they didn't take their eyes off each other. In fact, after that attack, the atmosphere had completely changed. Now it wasn't the same as before. Gwyn thought the fact that he had almost died was enough for such a weighty change to take place. As he watched the girl, he assumed that apparently she was starting to open up to him a little bit after all, and there was no way he wanted to lose that. It all started out of pure curiosity. Now, however, he wants to take full possession of her heart, and he won't give it up. Gwyn was actually having feelings like this for the first time in his life, and it was very strange to feel this way. He felt very vulnerable, even though he had always been strong. The man sat next to Dawn for a while, and then got up and started to leave. The girl sat still for a while, and then followed him. The distance she let him get was killing him, because he wasn't used to being so far away. He wants to be the only one she lets do that. At that moment, he bent down and made a small snowman out of the snow, which looked really cute. He then turned to the girl and asked if he needed to mold a house for Mr. Snowman. Dawn was silent for a while and then, after thinking about it, agreed. The man made a small house for the snowman, which looked very attractive. But then, suddenly he got some more snow in his hands. saying that he thought the snowman would be very lonely alone, and made him a pair. After that, Gwyn brought the snowman up to the first one and made them kiss. He immediately started messing around, changing their kissing positions and watching the girl's reaction. But soon he got tired of it. He put Snowman outside the house and asked her for some kind of reaction. Gwyn got to his feet and he cupped his hands and asked her to give him her hands. He then put them to his neck and felt very cold. The man said with a smile on his face, her hands were like ice. Their faces were very close because he moved closer to her. She replied in a shaky voice that it was because it was so cold. Gwyn kept holding her hands and said he knew it. She needs gloves and surprise shoes because otherwise she's just going to be sick. But the girl immediately began to refuse and said that it would be very expensive, and the man replied that it was all right for her. After all, it's cold and he doesn't want her to feel bad. They stood like that for a while longer, staring at each other in silence. Gwyn continued to hold her hands, to warm them. Then the man spoke first and said that she had become very silent lately and wondered if it was because of what had happened. Dawn didn't respond in any way. She just waved her head slightly so that if you didn't look closely, you wouldn't even notice it. The man was silent for a while longer, and after that, he said that her mind might be stuck in the war. But her body was still there, and there were still people around to keep her warm. He kissed her hands afterward and told her to remember that warmth and to never forget that she was no longer alone. Dawn was a little surprised at his assumptions and then said that war was the least of her worries. Gwyn was genuinely surprised to hear this, for he had thought she was so worried about the war. However, then with a sigh, he wondered what the war had taught her after all, other than how to keep quiet and hide her emotions. He also asked what kind of country she would like to build. Dawn was surprised by this questioning, but did not answer, and Gwyn earnestly asked that she tell him about the world she sees on the chessboard, the world she wants to have. He wondered what kind of land she represented, what kind of people she saw around her. He was really curious about it. The girl stood silent for a while. Then she reached for his hair and, fixing it, said that this would be a world where children could smile. It's the kind of world where there won't be adults grieving all the time, a world where seniors can live a completely peaceful life and enjoy it. It will be a world where people can live humanely, not as if they are some animals that will soon be killed and eaten. Gwyn, after listening to her carefully, soon smiled and said he agreed, and asked if she wanted to try to make that very peace. Dawn was very surprised to hear his suggestion. She didn't know he would take her words so seriously.